I'm checking the case chronology and evidence handling details first, so the opening portion stays accurate, while preserving the uninterrupted voiceover style you specified. Under the flat fluorescent light of an Alaska evidence room, the Sergie evidence box rests before you, beginning its journey through 26 long winters. Let your breathing settle, because nothing in this file needs to be hurried. The cardboard feels firm beneath your hands, though its corners have softened slightly, and somewhere inside lie the patient fragments of a case that once seemed unable to move. You can imagine the label first, typed or written in a careful official hand, carrying Sophie Sergie's name and the spring date when the investigation began. The room around you smells faintly of paper, dust, and controlled air, while shelving rises in still rows beyond the reach of your little lamp. The Sergie evidence box is not simply a container in our telling, but a place where time was asked to wait without disturbing what it held. Its silence would become useful. In the last days of April 1993, winter had not completely released Fairbanks, though the long northern light was already returning. Snowbanks remained beside roads and buildings, their surfaces darkened by road grit, while roofs released slow drops of water during the warmer hours. You can hear those drops tapping against metal ledges as we open the first folder. The pages bring us to Bartlett Hall, a residence building on the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus, where Sophie had come to spend a weekend among friends. She was 20 years old, and she had traveled from western Alaska to attend an orthodontic appointment in Fairbanks. Sophie came from Pitcairn Point, a small community beside the lower Yukon River, where distance was measured as much by weather and travel conditions as by miles. She knew the university campus because she had studied there before taking time away from school. As you turn her photograph toward the lamplight, the first thing the file asks us to remember is that Sophie possessed a full life beyond what happened at Bartlett Hall, a life made of family, plans, conversations, and ordinary hopes. Friends remembered someone cheerful and responsible, a young woman who kept in touch with her mother and looked ahead with patient purpose. She had thought about joining the Navy, as her brother had done, and she had also been interested in marine biology. During the school year of 1992 and 1993, she was working and attending to the practical matter of health insurance, because orthodontic care carried costs that couldn't be ignored. You can feel the gentle weight of that detail, because it places Sophie inside the familiar work of becoming an adult, arranging appointments and saving money while the future remains open. On Saturday, the 24th of April, Sophie flew into Fairbanks, carrying enough for a brief visit and expecting to return home after her appointment. The airport would have held the dry, mechanical warmth of terminals everywhere, along with the smell of coffee, damp coats, and aviation fuel drifting in whenever a door opened. Outside, the northern air was sharper, and old snow lay along the edges of the parking areas. We can picture Sophie stepping into that brightness, arriving not as a figure in a case file, but as a young woman beginning a familiar weekend of errands and visits. Her friends were part of a close circle of Alaska Native students and former students whose connections extended across villages, schools, leadership programs, and shared journeys into Fairbanks. Their friendships carried the comfort of common places and common distances, and a dormitory room could become a small gathering point where people exchanged news from home. You sit with this part of the file for a while, noticing how many names return across the interviews. Those names don't form a puzzle yet. They form a community. Sunday, the 25th of April, passed through simple activities that witnesses would later have to recall again and again. Sophie went to a hairdresser, spent time with friends, looked through magazines, and joined them for the film Indian Summer. These were the kinds of details that felt weightless when they occurred, though investigators would later record them in notebooks with measured care. As you follow the day, you can almost hear the soft rustle of magazine pages and the muted sound of a television in a dormitory room, keeping the hours gentle. That evening, Sophie and several friends drove toward Murphy Dome, beyond Fairbanks, where the land opens beneath a broad northern sky. The road climbed away from the city lights, passing dark ranks of spruce and stretches of snow that reflected the remaining evening glow. One photograph from the outing would become especially well known, showing Sophie outdoors with her arms extended, turning happily beneath that wide sky. We pause beside it, not because it foretells anything, but because it preserves a moment of joy, exactly as her friends remembered it. A photograph has a different weight when you hold it inside an evidence file, and you may notice how the paper resists your fingertips before bending slightly at the edge. Sophie appears alive to the evening, playful and unguarded, while the pale ground and distant horizon hold the quiet of late April. Her friend later remembered that she seemed happy simply to be there and to be living in that moment. We let the image remain what it was when the shutter closed, a record of friendship rather than a symbol of what came afterward. When the group returned to the university, Bartlett Hall would have been settling into the subdued rhythm of a Sunday night. Doors opened and closed along the corridors. Students talked quietly, and a television continued playing somewhere behind a thin wall. The building carried familiar dormitory smells, including laundry detergent, reheated food, old carpet, and the faint mineral scent of wet boots drying near heaters. As the detective tonight, you enter through those memories carefully, because every ordinary sound would later be measured against an uncertain timeline. Sophie planned to sleep in the room of her friend Shirley Ackelcock, who lived on the second floor. They shared pizza and soda with Shirley's boyfriend, and the evening passed without any reason to watch the clock closely. Shirley later left to spend the night elsewhere, allowing Sophie to use the bed before her dental appointment the following morning. You can imagine the small room after the door closed, with the television casting changing light across the walls and an unfinished cup resting near the bed. Sophie smoked cigarettes, and her friend had suggested that the enclosed bathtub area of the women's bathroom offered some shelter from the cold outside. It was nearby on the same floor, separated from the main corridor by doors and the practical arrangement of a shared residence hall. No one standing in that ordinary space would have thought of it as part of a future case file. We know more than they did, yet our task is to keep our voice low and stay with what can be established, one detail at a time. In the early hours of Monday, the 26th of April, Sophie left the dormitory room and did not return. The television apparently remained on, and the bed Shirley had offered her did not appear to have been slept in. Those observations would later settle into written reports, where a line of type could hold an entire night of uncertainty. You run your finger beneath the wording, and the paper feels slightly rough, reminding us that early investigations often begin with modest physical facts rather than complete answers. Monday morning arrived across the campus in the usual way, with students preparing for classes and staff beginning their rounds. The building's pipes carried water behind the walls. Janitorial carts moved along the corridors, and exterior doors admitted brief currents of cold air. Sophie did not appear for the appointment that had brought her to Fairbanks. At first, the separate facts had not yet drawn together, and you can sense how an ordinary morning continued around an absence that only gradually became visible. During the afternoon, a member of the custodial staff entered the second-floor bathroom while carrying out the familiar work of cleaning Bartlett Hall. One worker attended to the toilets, while another moved toward the shower and bathtub area, following a routine repeated on countless other days. There would have been the soft squeak of cartwheels and the clean chemical smell of disinfectant in the tiled room. What was found there made clear that Sophie's life had been taken, and the building's routine gave way to the slow work of careful investigation. We don't need to dwell on the condition of the room, because the lasting story lies in what investigators chose to preserve. Campus security and law enforcement personnel began restricting access, recording names, and noting where objects had been located. Photographs captured the arrangement of the space, while diagrams translated walls, doors, fixtures, and distances into lines on paper. You can imagine a camera shutter working in the bathroom's hard light, each measured exposure becoming another item that would enter the Sergie evidence file. The first hours of a major investigation carry a particular kind of concentration, quiet beneath all the necessary movement. Officers speak with custodians, residents, friends, and staff, while someone keeps a written log of those entering and leaving the secured area. Pens press into paper, adhesive labels cling to containers, and gloved hands package materials according to the methods available in 1993. The air may feel overly warm beneath protective clothing, yet the work must remain deliberate. Evidence is not useful merely because it has been collected. It must also be described, sealed, transported, recorded, and protected from avoidable change. Each transfer creates another signature or notation, forming what investigators call a chain of custody. You can see that chain without needing to make it dramatic, because it resembles a series of small promises written beside dates and names. One person receives an item, another stores it, and a laboratory worker later opens it under controlled conditions, with every movement made accountable. The Sergie evidence box, as we sit with it tonight, represents more than a single cardboard carton resting on one shelf. A major case can produce several containers, separate laboratory samples, photographic records, interview files, and sealed items stored under different conditions. Some materials require cool, controlled environments, while paper can remain in folders whose edges gradually grow soft. Still, the image of one box helps us understand the central patience of the case, because everything depended upon keeping the old evidence available. At the Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory, biological material collected during the investigation could be examined using the forensic tools of that era. DNA analysis existed in 1993, but its capabilities were narrower, its processes slower, and its need for usable material often greater than investigators would expect in later decades. You sit beside the imaginary laboratory bench, hearing the low hum of equipment and the soft click of capped tubes being placed into racks. Science was already speaking, though its vocabulary was still limited. The investigators understood that biological evidence might preserve information no witness could provide. Laboratory personnel used swabs, gauze, slides, and other carefully prepared materials, then documented what had been collected and how it had been handled. The containers were small compared with the importance eventually placed upon them. If you lift one in your imagination, it seems almost weightless, yet it carries a human identity in patterns too small for the unaided eye to see. Early DNA profiles were commonly built by examining selected regions of genetic material where people tend to differ. The process did not read a whole life, reveal memories, or describe a person's character. It produced a technical pattern that could be compared with another sample. This distinction matters as we work through the file, because forensic DNA is powerful precisely when investigators remain careful about what it can and cannot say. It can establish a biological relationship between samples, while the larger case still requires context, records, and reason. A male DNA profile was eventually developed from the evidence preserved in Sophie Sergie's case. Investigators could compare that profile with known samples and later place it into national law enforcement databases designed to look for direct matches. Yet a database can only return what has previously entered it. If the person connected with an unknown profile has never supplied DNA through a qualifying arrest, conviction, or another lawful process, the computer has nothing corresponding to find. You can imagine the moment when a search result returned without a useful match, though it probably arrived with little ceremony. There may have been a screen filled with coded fields, a printed page, and the faint dry warmth of a laser printer nearby. The profile was valuable, but it had no name attached to it. Investigators had preserved a clear question in scientific form, and then they had to accept that the available system could not yet provide an answer. This is where patience enters the Sergie case in its most practical form, not as passive waiting, but as the repeated protection of possibility. A sealed sample must remain sealed when there is no reason to open it, because every test may consume some material. A folder must remain legible, a label must stay attached, and a storage record must allow a future investigator to locate what an earlier investigator placed there. You close the inner file gently, aware that restraint can become an investigative act. But before the evidence could wait, detectives had to understand the crowded residence hall around it. And so we move from the laboratory bench back into Bartlett Hall. The building housed many students whose routines overlapped through stairwells, shared bathrooms, corridors, and common areas. Some residents knew Sophie, some recognized her, and others may only have passed her without registering the moment. You hear the clatter of a distant door as the interviews begin, followed by the soft scratch of a pen crossing paper. Investigators spoke with Sophie's friends and tried to reconstruct the hours between her return from Murphy Dome and the discovery the following afternoon. They asked when people had last seen her, what she had been wearing, where she intended to sleep, and whether anything unusual had been noticed. Such questions can feel repetitive, particularly when the witness is tired or grieving. Yet you know, sitting with the transcripts now, that repetition sometimes allows a remembered detail. to emerge more clearly. The residence hall itself complicated this work, because it was not a private home with only a few known occupants. Students came and went, friends visited, staff performed their duties, and doors did not preserve a complete record of every passage. A person in the corridor might remember a face, but not the exact time, while another might remember a sound without knowing its source. We resist the temptation to force these fragments together too quickly, because an honest file must leave uncertain things uncertain. One witness remembered sounds during the night that could have had several ordinary explanations inside a dormitory. Others tried to place people on particular floors, in particular rooms, or moving along particular corridors. Years later, these memories would be revisited in interviews and testimony, each one carrying the natural wear that time brings. You can almost feel the thin cassette tape turning in an early recorder, preserving voices beneath a faint background hiss. Detectives also had to identify Sophie formally and notify those closest to her, work that belongs to the most human and difficult part of any case. Her family had expected her to attend an appointment and return, not to become the center of an investigation hundreds of miles from home. The distance between Fairbanks and Pitcairn Point could not be erased by a telephone call or a typed report. As we hold that knowledge, the official language on the page becomes heavier. Sophie's mother had been accustomed to hearing from her regularly, and that pattern of contact mattered because it reflected the closeness of their family. Friends remembered Sophie as someone who checked in and behaved responsibly, not someone likely to vanish without explanation. Investigators record such observations, partly because habits can help establish what was unusual. For us, they also restore the warm background of daily affection that official forms can never fully contain. The case reached beyond a single campus and into the broader concerns surrounding violence against Alaska Native women, whose lives and disappearances have too often received uneven attention. In 1993, that wider pattern was not discussed publicly with the same language or sustained focus it receives today. Sophie's family did not need a larger framework to understand the value of her life, of course, because they already knew it intimately. Still, as you review the file, you recognize why remembering her name became an act of persistence. During those first weeks, investigators followed leads that arose from interviews, physical evidence, and the known movements of people in Bartlett Hall. Names were written down, checked, reconsidered, and sometimes set aside when information failed to support further attention. A lead sheet can look plain beneath your lamp, with boxes for dates, assignments, and results, but each line may represent hours of travel or conversation. The Sergie investigation grew through these quiet administrative forms, one entry beside another. Fairbanks itself was changing with the season as the work continued. Snow withdrew from open ground, revealing flattened grass, gravel, and the small debris held beneath winter for months. Daylight lingered later each evening, while office windows reflected a sky that seemed reluctant to darken. Detectives returned to desks under electric lights anyway, reading statements while the smell of cooling coffee and photocopier toner settled around them. You stay beside them, turning pages at their unhurried pace. The first summer came, and with it the understanding that no immediate arrest was approaching. This did not mean the evidence had failed, nor did it mean the investigation had been forgotten. It meant the facts then available had not joined into a case strong enough to identify and charge a particular person. You slide the folder back into its place, hearing cardboard brush against cardboard, and begin to understand how a cold case enters its long season of waiting. Waiting changes a file differently from the way it changes a person. The paper stays where it has been placed, while detectives transfer assignments, witnesses move away, students graduate, and families continue through years they never expected to count. A storage shelf doesn't feel disappointment when another database search returns nothing. People do, and then they return to their work, carrying the unanswered name with them in a quiet part of the mind. Sophie's friends left the campus and built lives in other places, but the spring of 1993 remained accessible whenever a new call came from an investigator. They were asked to revisit rooms that no longer looked the same, conversations whose exact wording had faded, and a night once surrounded by ordinary plans. You can feel how difficult such remembering becomes, not because a person doesn't care, but because memory is living material rather than a sealed exhibit. It changes around the edges. A physical sample behaves differently when it has been collected and stored with care. It doesn't try to make sense of the years, and it doesn't fill missing space with later knowledge. The genetic pattern remains within it, subject to chemical change and the conditions of preservation, but free from the emotional movement of memory. This was why the contents associated with the Sergie evidence box could someday answer a question that interviews alone had been unable to settle. Still, the box could not decide when that day would arrive. It depended upon laboratory science becoming more sensitive, computer databases becoming larger, and investigators recognizing a new method as suitable for an old Alaska case. None of those changes came at once. They accumulated across conferences, research papers, upgraded instruments, new legal policies, and thousands of other investigations, while Sophie's evidence remained quietly stored. The first winter, after Sophie's death, settled over Fairbanks with familiar thoroughness. Temperatures fell, daylight narrowed, and frost gathered on the edges of office windows, where investigators continued their other cases. Somewhere within the evidence system, the sealed materials connected to Sophie remained protected from the weather outside. You can picture snow brushing against the building in fine, dry grains, while inside, shelves held their level rows beneath a steady mechanical hum. That winter was followed by another, and the calendar moved with the patient regularity of paper being added to a file. A year marker altered the date on new correspondence, though it did not change the central unanswered question. Investigators could compare the unknown DNA profile again when circumstances allowed, but comparison required another profile to meet it. The evidence was ready in a way the surrounding world was not yet ready. By the middle of the 1990s, forensic DNA work was advancing rapidly, and courts, laboratories, and police agencies were learning how to use it responsibly. New testing methods could sometimes work with smaller quantities and produce profiles at more standardized genetic locations. National systems were developing so profiles from distant jurisdictions could be searched against one another. From our quiet desk, these changes may seem like a clear road forward, though the road was built gradually, one technical decision at a time. No instrument arrived bearing Sophie's name, and no database expansion guaranteed that her case would be solved. Scientific progress is broad, while a cold case is painfully specific. Someone still had to review the old material, decide which test was appropriate, confirm that enough sample remained, complete the paperwork, and interpret the result carefully. You begin to see that the evidence box survived, not through luck alone, but through a chain of people choosing to preserve options for colleagues they might never meet. Some of those people would never learn the final outcome while they were still working. A technician who sealed a sample in 1993 could only follow the standards of that day without knowing what a laboratory might accomplish 20 years later. A property clerk might check a label, update a location record, and return the item to storage without hearing anything more about it. Yet those nearly invisible actions became part of the eventual answer, each one a small piece of institutional memory. You can imagine the evidence room at the end of a shift, when footsteps recede and the overhead lights are switched off in sections. The shelves remain in darkness, holding cases that are active, dormant, solved, or waiting for a method not yet invented. Nothing about that room resembles the dramatic image of detective work often shown on a screen. Its strength lies in order, temperature, labels, locks, and the quiet refusal to discard what may still have meaning. The Sergie materials passed through more winters, while the university campus changed around the absence left behind. New students arrived at Bartlett Hall without remembering the spring of 1993, and older residents carried their memories into adulthood. Carpets were replaced, walls were painted, and equipment throughout the campus grew newer. The case records, however, preserved the old layout in measured photographs and diagrams, allowing you to return to that second-floor corridor whenever the investigation required review. Each review began with much the same gesture we make tonight, opening a folder and returning to the earliest reports. Detectives looked for missed names, contradictions, overlooked connections, and evidence that newer science might examine more effectively. The paper could feel cold after storage, and photocopied text might have softened into grey along the folds. Still, the central facts remained legible, waiting for someone with fresh experience to ask a slightly different question. Cold casework often looks backward, while keeping one eye on the tools of the present. An investigator must respect what earlier detectives knew without assuming their conclusions were final, because every inquiry is shaped by the limits of its moment. At the same time, old witnesses shouldn't be pushed to offer certainty they no longer possess. You sit between those responsibilities, balancing the stable language of laboratory reports against memories that have traveled through many years. There were names in the Sergie file that drew attention at different times, and investigators considered possibilities suggested by friendships, dormitory access, personal histories, and witness recollections. Some individuals provided samples or were excluded through available evidence, while other leads weakened when examined more closely. We don't need to turn those people into shadows around Sophie's story. The patient approach is to notice how a large field of possibilities slowly narrowed, not through intuition alone, but through documented elimination. The unknown DNA profile remained the most consistent element. It did not grow less unknown when investigators stared at it longer, but it retained the same comparison points as databases expanded. Each direct search asked a simple question: does the system contain another profile matching this one? For years the reply remained negative, and you can hear a printer deliver another quiet page while the sealed original evidence rests nearby, still holding more information than the existing search could reach. A negative result can feel empty, though scientifically it has a clear meaning. It says that no qualifying match appeared among the profiles searched at that particular time, under that particular method. It doesn't say that no answer exists, and it doesn't erase the value of a well-preserved sample. This distinction allowed investigators to continue without pretending they had learned more than they truly had, which is one of the gentlest forms of discipline in detective work. Years passed, and the children of 1993 grew into adults who carried small computers in their pockets and sent messages across great distances almost instantly. Laboratories adopted instruments that earlier technicians could scarcely have imagined using in routine casework. Genetic databases grew, software improved, and fragments of biological material yielded clearer profiles with less consumption. The evidence associated with Sophie remained connected to the original chain of custody, bridging an older forensic world with the one slowly coming into view. As you turn another page, you may notice how the language changes across the decades. Early reports describe physical comparison and conventional interviews, while later pages speak more often of loci, database uploads, statistical strength, and renewed laboratory requests. The typefaces change as well, moving from typewriter impressions and early printed forms toward cleaner digital documents. Even the paper tells us that time is passing, though the name at the top remains Sophie. Her family experienced those same years without the protection of a sealed container. Birthdays came, seasons changed beside the lower Yukon, and news about the case arrived irregularly, sometimes bringing movement, and sometimes only confirmation that the work continued. Hope in a cold case is rarely bright or simple. It can be a modest willingness to answer another telephone call, speak with another investigator, and believe that preserved evidence may still have something truthful to offer. The detectives who returned to the Sergie file understood that an old case carries obligations to the living as well as the dead. They had to communicate carefully, avoid promises, and explain why a new examination might still produce no result. Every proposed test involved judgment, because biological evidence can be finite. You place the laboratory request beside the earlier report and feel the tension, not as suspense, but as responsibility held steadily between two hands. By the time a dedicated cold case investigator studied the materials again, the file had already survived changes in personnel, procedures, buildings, and technology. The investigation was not untouched by those changes, yet its essential evidence remained usable. That survival was the quiet achievement beneath everything that followed. Before genetic genealogy could offer a new direction, someone had to open the old container and find that the original work had left a path still intact. And so we arrive at another winter in Fairbanks, when the windows darken early and the evidence room seems separated from the weather by concrete, insulation, and steady electric light. The box comes down from its shelf once more, leaving a clean rectangular space in the dust. You carry it to the table, set it beneath the lamp, and read the familiar name before loosening the next folder. This time, the world outside the box has learned a new way to listen. I'm carrying the narration forward through the cold case review and genetic genealogy work, while keeping the chronology precise and the voiceover uninterrupted. The new way of listening began with a profile produced around the year 2000, when laboratory methods had advanced beyond those available in 1993. Technicians developed a usable male DNA profile from material preserved in Sophie Sergie's case, then entered it into the National Law Enforcement Database. You can imagine the monitor glowing in a quiet office while coded markers filled the screen. The old evidence had found a clearer voice, although it still had no name. The system searched for a direct match among profiles already stored there, comparing the unknown pattern with those submitted by agencies across the country. A match would have suggested that the same person's DNA had entered the database through another authorized process. No such profile appeared, and the result returned to the file without changing its official status. As we read that page, we understand that the computer had answered accurately, but only within the narrow boundaries of what it knew. This distinction is easy to miss when you're looking backward from a time of advanced genetic searches. A database doesn't reach outward into the general population, nor does it recognize a person whose profile has never been included. It compares one pattern with a defined collection of other patterns, methodically and without intuition. Sophie's evidence remained capable of identification, yet the corresponding person was standing somewhere beyond the database's shore. The result gave investigators something stable to carry forward, because a reliable unknown profile could be checked again as the national collection grew. New profiles entered the system, year after year, and automated processes could reveal a match if one eventually appeared. You may picture the Sergie case resting among thousands of others, while distant computers performed their quiet comparisons. Each search preserved the same modest possibility, and each winter left that possibility unchanged. Around the evidence box, however, the physical world continued its steady movement. Storage rooms were reorganized, records were transferred into newer systems, and fresh labels sometimes accompanied older handwritten ones. The sealed samples required appropriate conditions, while the paper investigation accumulated reports from additional interviews and periodic reviews. You can feel the cool metal of the shelving as we return the box, trusting that orderly custody will carry it into another season. Cold case investigators know that a file can appear motionless while the field around it changes considerably. A technique, unavailable 1 year, may become accepted practice several years later, and a sample once considered too small may become suitable for newer analysis. Laws, laboratory standards, and database rules can also change, requiring detectives to understand more than the scientific method alone. As you sit beside the lamp, you begin to see patience as a form of continuing education. But science was not the only path through the Sophie Sergie case, and in the years after the DNA profile was developed, investigators returned to the people connected with Bartlett Hall. Some former students now lived far from Fairbanks, and locating them required old directories, public records, telephone calls, and patient correspondence. A college address from 1993 might lead to a family home, then to a later workplace, and eventually to a current number. You follow those pencil lines across the page, watching distance become workable. Re-interviewing a witness after many years requires a different manner from the first conversation. The investigator can't reasonably expect the precise clock times or exact phrases that seemed uncertain even during the original inquiry. Instead, questions may focus on durable memories, such as the shape of a room, a person's usual habits, or an object seen repeatedly. You can almost hear the pause before an answer, while the witness searches through layers of life for something still clear. The old statements remain nearby during that process, but they must be handled with care. Showing a witness too much can influence recollection, while ignoring the earlier account may waste information recorded closer to the event. Detectives compare language, note differences, and avoid treating every change as deception. Memory is not an evidence locker, as you already know. It's more like a path across tundra, recognizable in places and softened in others. By the late 2000s, the Sergie file contained years of accumulated effort. Investigators had spoken with numerous people, examined possible suspects, compared samples, and followed information that did not lead to a charge. The volume of paper itself became substantial, eventually growing into thousands of pages and many recorded interviews. When you lift one portion of the record, its weight presses into your palm, a physical measure of all the hours already spent. In 2010, one cold case review led investigators back to Nicholas Dazer, who had been a student security guard at the university. He had also known Stephen Downes during their first year and had once shared a room with him. The interview took place far from the original campus, in an office where the furnishings and daylight belonged to another time in both men's lives. You settle beside the recorded account, listening through the faint electronic grain of an old recollection. Dazer described firearms he remembered from the university years, including a small caliber revolver he associated with Downes. Such a memory did not establish what had happened to Sophie, and detectives still had to compare it with other statements and physical findings. It was one detail among many, important enough to record but not sufficient to settle the case. We place it carefully in the chronology rather than letting it carry more weight than the evidence allowed. The interview illustrates why cold case work moves slowly even after an apparently relevant detail appears. Investigators must ask when the object was seen, whether the witness could distinguish its make or caliber, and whether anyone else could confirm the account. They must also consider how friendship, distance, and the passage of years may affect the memory. You can hear pages turning between questions as the detective keeps the conversation measured. Other former students recalled weapons, clothing, friendships, room assignments, and movements within Bartlett Hall, though those accounts did not always agree. A residence hall near the end of a semester contains many overlapping lives, and no single witness observes the whole. The work therefore resembled laying transparent sheets over one another, searching for lines that remained consistent across separate sources. As we align those sheets beneath our lamp, much of the page still looks open. Investigators also requested DNA samples from individuals whose names had arisen during the inquiry. The collection itself could be simple, often involving a swab rubbed gently inside the cheek, but the surrounding procedure mattered greatly. Identity had to be confirmed, consent or legal authority documented, and the sample labeled before entering the chain of custody. You can imagine the paper packet closing with a dry whisper, carrying another comparison toward the laboratory. When those known samples did not match the unknown male profile, the exclusions had genuine value. Each one removed a possible explanation and protected people from remaining indefinitely beneath suspicion. An exclusion doesn't identify the contributor, yet it narrows the field with scientific firmness. We pause over these results because patient investigation is not only about finding the right person, it's also about clearing those whom the evidence does not support. The years continued, and the direct database searches remained silent. Somewhere else, a qualifying profile might have entered the system and produced the long-awaited match, but that did not occur. The unknown contributor apparently had not become visible through the conventional route available to investigators. You close the database report and hear the folder's metal fastener settle against the paper, a small sound in a case defined by waiting. Outside the evidence room, personal DNA testing was beginning to enter ordinary homes. People ordered kits to explore ancestry, locate relatives, and understand branches of family history that had been scattered by migration or lost records. A tube or cheek swab traveled through the mail, and weeks later a website displayed regions, matches, and names. None of this began as part of the Sergie investigation. Yet it was quietly building a new kind of map. The genetic information used for ancestry research differs in scale and purpose from the smaller set of markers traditionally used in law enforcement databases. Consumer genealogy tests examine hundreds of thousands of positions across the genome, producing a broad pattern useful for detecting shared segments among relatives. A direct match is no longer required because cousins can share enough inherited material to reveal that their family lines meet. You trace this idea slowly, following one branch toward another beneath the warm circle of lamplight. Every person receives portions of DNA from parents, who received portions from their own parents, and the pattern continues backward through generations. The pieces are rearranged along the way, so relatives don't carry identical sets unless they are identical twins. Even so, recognizable segments may remain shared among siblings, cousins, and more distant connections. You can think of it as an old quilt divided and re-sewn many times, with familiar pieces appearing in households that no longer know one another. Genealogists had long built family trees from birth records, marriage notices, census pages, obituaries, church registers, and family recollections. Genetic matching added another layer, suggesting where two documented trees might connect, even when a name had been altered or a record was incomplete. The work remained patient and often uncertain, requiring confirmation from several independent sources. As you turn an imaginary census page, the dry paper seems to carry both public history and private kinship. By the middle of the 2010s, investigators in several places were considering whether those family connections might help with unknown forensic profiles. The concept was simple to describe but demanding to carry out. An unknown sample could be examined at many genetic positions, then compared with profiles in a genealogy database that permitted such searching. Any relatives found would provide starting points, not conclusions. From there, a genealogist might build trees backward to common ancestors and then forward through descendants. Ages, locations, family relationships, and the sex of the unknown contributor could gradually reduce a large number of possibilities. The method resembled archival work more than a dramatic laboratory revelation, with hours spent reading obituaries and checking dates. You can imagine the quiet clicking of a mouse, the smell of tea cooling beside the keyboard, and names branching across a screen. The method became widely known in 2018 after investigators in California used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in a series of crimes that had remained unresolved for decades. Cold case detectives across the country began looking again at preserved biological evidence, asking whether an old unknown profile might be suitable for this newer kind of search. The news reached Alaska, not as a command, but as a possibility. Somewhere, a detective read about the technique and thought of the Sergie evidence box. Randall McFerrin, an investigator with the Alaska State Troopers Cold Case Investigation Unit, recognized that Sophie's case might contain the necessary material. He knew there was an established male profile that had never produced a direct database match. He also understood that the original evidence had survived more than 25 years of storage and prior examination. You can picture him returning to the file, where the pages smelled faintly of toner and old cardboard. The first question was not whether genetic genealogy would solve the case, but whether the forensic sample could support the required testing. Conventional law enforcement profiling and genealogy analysis examine DNA in different ways, so the existing profile could not simply be copied into the new system. The laboratory would need to consider the amount and quality of remaining material. We sit beside that decision, aware that every preserved fragment represented a finite resource. McFerrin consulted with the Alaska Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory about what remained and whether another analysis was reasonable. Laboratory staff reviewed records that stretched back through earlier tests, noting what had been consumed and what had been retained. This was where good documentation became as important as cold storage, because a current scientist needed to understand every prior opening of the evidence. You can hear a binder ring click shut as the options become clearer. A decision to proceed required confidence that the potential value justified using part of the remaining sample. No one could promise that a genealogy database would contain a helpful relative, and even a strong relative match might lead into a family tree with missing branches. The process could end with no candidate at all, yet the sample had been preserved for precisely this kind of future opportunity, and the investigators chose to let science ask another question. In September of 2018, the forensic material was submitted for genetic genealogy analysis. The sample traveled through documented custody to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company performing advanced DNA work and investigative genealogy. Its journey crossed thousands of miles that Sophie herself had never traveled, moving from Alaska toward a laboratory where newer instruments could examine the old biological pattern. You follow the sealed package in thought, hearing aircraft engines fade into the steady hum of another evidence facility. At the laboratory, technicians sought to create what is called a single nucleotide polymorphism profile, usually shortened to an SNP profile. These markers are tiny variations at positions distributed across a person's genetic material, and a large collection of them can reveal patterns of shared inheritance. The work required extracting and processing DNA that had waited since 1993. Beneath bright laboratory lights, the old sample met equipment built in an entirely different century. You can imagine the contrast without turning it into a sudden transformation. The original gauze, swabs, and careful handwritten records belonged to an era of fax machines, paper directories, and early forensic DNA testing. The newer laboratory relied on dense computer files, automated instruments, and algorithms capable of comparing vast numbers of markers. Between them stood the unbroken chain of custody, quiet as a bridge laid across 25 winters. The resulting profile did not contain a name. It contained patterns that might overlap with the genetic patterns of relatives who had chosen to upload their own data to a genealogy service. This point matters because genetic genealogy rarely begins with the person being sought. It begins with strangers who are not truly strangers at the biological level, people connected through grandparents or more distant ancestors whose lives may have crossed long before the present investigation. We move through that shared history with care. The profile was compared through GED Match, a service where users could upload raw data from consumer testing companies and look for relatives across platforms. At the time, its database held roughly 1,200,000 profiles, a large collection, but still a small portion of the population. The search examined how much DNA the unknown person shared with individual users and where those segments appeared. You watch the progress bar without hurry, knowing that the result will require interpretation. A list of genetic matches is not arranged like a list of suspects. It may include aliases, email addresses, shared segment measurements, and estimates of possible relationships, all of which can cover several different family arrangements. A predicted second cousin might fit more than one path through grandparents and great-grandparents. The genealogist must test each possibility against records and other matches. We begin with branches rather than accusations, and that difference keeps the work grounded. One useful match belonged to a woman who had uploaded her information while searching for relatives. Her shared DNA indicated that the unknown male, in Sophie's case, belonged somewhere within her extended family. She had not uploaded the profile to identify him, and she had no role in the events at Bartlett Hall. Yet, the inherited pieces they shared created a route toward a family line that conventional databases had never been able to see. The genealogist examining the match was C.C. Moore, whose work involved combining shared DNA measurements with documentary research. She began constructing the relevant family branches, using public records to understand how generations connected and where descendants had lived. Birth announcements, obituaries, marriage records, addresses, and social information each provided modest pieces. You can hear keys moving softly beneath her fingers while the family tree widens across the monitor. This stage could not be rushed because names repeat, dates conflict, and public records sometimes contain mistakes. A person may use a middle name in one document and a first name in another, while marriages, adoptions, and relocations complicate the branches. Every apparent connection must be tested against the genetic estimate and known family structure. As the detective at our quiet desk, you check each line twice before carrying it forward in pencil. The shared segments suggested that the unknown contributor was related through a particular side of the woman's family. Genetic inheritance could narrow the line, while the male profile and estimated ancestry offered additional guidance. From there, the genealogist worked through descendants whose ages and histories might fit the person represented by the forensic sample. Most could be set aside because they were too old, too young, the wrong sex, or had no plausible connection with Alaska. Location became especially important because the unknown male had to have had some opportunity to encounter Sophie in Fairbanks during April of 1993. A family member living all his life in another region might be biologically possible, but geographically implausible. Public records could show schooling, residences, employment, and other movements, though each fact needed verification. You can imagine a map beside the family tree, one line stretching northwest toward the university campus. Among the descendants considered, one name aligned with the necessary place and time. Stephen Harris Downs had attended the University of Alaska Fairbanks as a freshman during the school year when Sophie died. He had lived in Bartlett Hall, not in a distant building, but on the third floor, one level above the women's bathroom and the room where Sophie had expected to sleep. The family tree had reached the old floor plan, and two separate forms of evidence now touched the same building. This did not prove that Downs was the source of the DNA, and it did not by itself prove any crime. Genetic genealogy is an investigative lead, a way to identify someone whose conventional sample can then be collected and compared through established forensic methods. The careful distinction mattered to McFerrin and the others handling the case. We write the name in the margin for the first time, but we do not yet write certainty beside it. Investigators began verifying the genealogist's findings independently. They checked Downs's date of birth, education, dormitory residence, family relationships, and later addresses, building a conventional factual record around the genetic lead. Each confirmation came from sources separate from the inference itself. You can picture property records, university documents, directory entries, and public filings spread across a desk, their paper textures differing, while the identifying details remain consistent. Downs had been 18 years old during the spring of 1993. He studied at the university, lived among the students of Bartlett Hall, and continued his education after leaving Alaska. His later life carried him through several places and occupations before he settled in Maine and worked as a nurse. The years that had been winters in the Sergie evidence room were full adult decades elsewhere, passing without a public connection between his name and Sophie's case. Investigators reviewed the old dormitory records with new attention, locating Downs within the physical environment described by witnesses. The second-floor bathroom remained below his residence, while his girlfriend at the time had lived elsewhere in Bartlett Hall. People moved freely enough within the building that floor assignments could not establish anyone's exact location during a particular hour. Still, the records confirmed the basic opportunity required by the genealogical lead. The cold case team also returned to statements from people who had known Downs at the university. They examined recollections about his whereabouts, his habits, and objects he may have possessed, including the small-caliber firearm mentioned years earlier. Some accounts were firm in parts and uncertain in others, as you would expect after a quarter-century. We keep the contradictions visible because careful investigation doesn't smooth rough evidence merely to make the pages neater. One former girlfriend remembered that Downs had been present around her room during portions of the relevant night, though she could not provide an uninterrupted account across every hour. Later testimony would describe him as being in and out, a phrase that carried uncertainty rather than a precise timetable. Investigators compared this with what Downs himself would eventually say. You underline the words lightly, knowing that memory can establish a general pattern without supplying a complete clock. Other physical evidence from the original investigation did not point clearly toward Downs. Fingerprints, hairs, fibers, and impressions collected in 1993 had not identified him, and some materials could not be connected to anyone in a meaningful way. A responsible file has room for both supporting and non-supporting facts. As we turn these reports beneath the lamp, we let each keep its proper place without demanding that every item speak the same language. The DNA lead remained central because it concerned biological material preserved directly through Sophie's examination. Yet even strong DNA evidence requires an account of how the material came to be present, and investigators knew that a court would consider possible innocent explanations. They would need to ask Downs whether he had known Sophie or had any prior contact with her. His answer would become part of the case, but that conversation still lay several thousand miles away. Before approaching him, investigators sought confirmation that their lead pointed to the correct family member. Genealogical estimates can allow several relationship paths, especially when families have multiple branches of similar age. The fact that Downs had lived in Bartlett Hall made him a compelling candidate, but compelling is not identical to confirmed. You can feel the restraint in the investigative notes, as each assertion remains qualified until conventional testing can provide a comparison. The team considered ways to obtain a discarded item carrying his DNA without alerting him. Investigators sometimes watch for a person to leave a cup, tissue, utensil, or other object in a public place where it can be lawfully recovered. Such surveillance can require days of quiet observation, most of them yielding nothing at all. From a parked vehicle in Maine, the detectives would hear heaters blowing and tires moving over winter roads while they waited for an ordinary gesture. A utility pole camera was used to observe the area around Downs's home, and investigators hoped he might place household trash where it could be collected. They also watched for visits to places where he might discard something after eating or drinking. The plan depended upon routine behavior, yet routine did not cooperate on command. You sit through those uneventful hours with them, watching bare branches shift against a pale northeastern sky. For roughly a month, the surveillance did not produce the usable discarded sample investigators wanted. A person may carry a cup away, dispose of material where it cannot be retrieved, or simply remain at home more than expected. Cold case work had already waited decades, so another month was not remarkable in itself. Still, the team needed a practical next step, and the file moved from passive observation toward direct contact. Maine State Police officers prepared to visit Downs at his home and ask about his years at the University of Alaska, Fairbanks. The approach had to preserve the investigation while allowing him an opportunity to explain any connection with Sophie. Photographs and background questions could help determine whether he recognized her. You can imagine the cold air entering when the door opened, along with the muted sound of traffic from the winter street beyond the porch. During the brief conversation, Downs said he had not known Sophie Sergie and did not remember meeting her. He acknowledged living in Bartlett Hall, but offered no personal contact that could explain why his family line had surfaced in the genetic investigation. The denial mattered because it removed a possible acknowledged association from his account. We record it without raising our voice, placing his words beside the laboratory lead and leaving the comparison visible. Investigators then sought legal authority to collect a direct DNA sample and fingerprints from him. A judge reviewing such a request would consider the genealogical analysis, his presence in Bartlett Hall, the preserved forensic profile, and other facts developed through the investigation. The process translated months of technical and archival work into sworn written language. You can almost smell fresh printer paper as pages emerge, warm and slightly curled, ready for careful review. A direct cheek swab would allow the Alaska laboratory to compare Downs through traditional forensic profiling rather than genealogy estimates. The procedure would be simple in physical terms, requiring only a sterile applicator and a few moments, but its evidentiary importance was considerable. Identity, collection time, packaging, and custody all had to be documented. You watch the swab disappear into its labeled envelope, returning us to the same habits of preservation that began in 1993. Fingerprints were collected as well, though they did not match usable prints recovered during the original investigation. That result did not erase the DNA lead, just as the DNA lead did not transform every other item into supporting evidence. Different forms of evidence answer different questions, and a print can only be compared if it was left on a suitable surface and recovered clearly. We keep that limitation in mind, while the ink's slight tackiness fades from the fingerprint card. The cheek swab traveled back through controlled custody for comparison with the male profile derived from Sophie's preserved evidence. This time, the laboratory was not searching an enormous database for an unknown person. It had two defined profiles, one from the old forensic material and one collected directly from the man identified through genealogy. You can sense the change in scale, from a branching family tree to two precise patterns placed quietly side by side. Laboratory analysts follow validated procedures intended to reduce error, contamination, and overstatement. Controls accompany the samples, instruments record results, and another qualified person may review the interpretation before it is released. The room itself remains practical and bright, filled with racks, sealed containers, smooth counters, and equipment producing steady background noise. We wait there, without urgency, because the value of an answer depends upon the care used to reach it. The comparison showed that the direct sample from Stephen Downs matched the unknown male profile preserved in Sophie Sergie's case. Genetic genealogy had supplied the name, but conventional forensic testing provided the confirmation investigators needed. 26 winters after the original collection, the old evidence had identified its source through a person who once lived one floor above the place where Sophie was found. You rest your hand upon the report and feel the quiet gravity of continuity. Even then, the investigation did not become simple. A DNA match established the biological source of the preserved material, while prosecutors still had to consider context, witness accounts, alternative explanations, and the legal standards required for charges. Downs had denied knowing Sophie, creating a direct conflict between his account and the laboratory result. The cold case team now returned to every older page, reading familiar sentences in the presence of a newly confirmed name. Investigators from Alaska traveled to Maine for a fuller interview, carrying questions shaped by the dormitory records and the genetic findings. The geographic distance was considerable, but the documentary path between Fairbanks and Auburn had become exact. Outside, February held both places in winter, though the snow, daylight, and buildings belonged to very different landscapes. You accompany them into the interview room, where chairs stand on a hard floor and a recorder waits beneath a small red light. Downs described his university years and said he had been with his girlfriend during the night Sophie died. He continued to deny knowing Sophie, meeting her, or having any intimate contact with her. When investigators explained that DNA linked him to the preserved sample, he suggested there must have been a mistake or some other explanation. His voice entered the case record, joining the older witness tapes and the newer, laboratory documents. The detectives did not need to raise their voices because the questions themselves were sufficient. They asked how his DNA could be present if he had never known Sophie, whether he remembered seeing her photograph, and whether laboratory error could reasonably account for the match. Downs maintained that the finding could not be correct. You listen from our quiet desk, noticing the low room tone and the measured pauses that settle between each answer. At the same time, additional search warrants allowed investigators to examine his home for items potentially relevant to the original case. The search produced firearms and knives, though later forensic examination could not establish that any particular item had been used in Sophie's death. A small caliber revolver drew attention because of the evidence from 1993, but the recovered projectile was too damaged for identification to a specific weapon. We leave that uncertainty plainly marked in the file. The inability to connect a weapon did not alter the direct DNA comparison, but it shaped the kind of case prosecutors would eventually present. There was no single object carrying every answer, no complete eyewitness account, and no recorded admission. Instead, there was a preserved biological profile, a dormitory connection, statements made decades apart, and the accumulated work of many investigators. You spread these categories across the table, allowing their different textures to remain distinct. On the 15th of February, 2019, Stephen Downs was arrested in Maine and charged in connection with Sophie Sergie's death and assault. The arrest came almost 26 years after that Monday afternoon in Bartlett Hall, when custodial workers had begun the chain of discovery and preservation. Yet the case still faced extradition, pre-trial challenges, witness preparation, and the enormous labor of making an old investigation understandable in court. The evidence box had reached a new room, but its journey was far from finished. News of the arrest traveled back to Fairbanks, to the university community, and to Sophie's family in western Alaska, where people who had lived with the unanswered case since 1993. The announcement carried emotions too complex for a single official phrase. Relief could exist beside caution, grief, memory, and the knowledge that a charge was not yet a conviction. We sit respectfully with that mixture, hearing telephones ring in homes where Sophie's name had never become past. The cold case investigators now faced the practical challenge of organizing more than 2 decades of accumulated material for prosecutors and defense attorneys. Old recordings needed to be located and copied, reports had to be indexed, and physical evidence required renewed documentation. Witnesses scattered across many locations would have to be found again. You can picture boxes opening across a long conference table, releasing the faint smell of aging paper into the room. More than 8,000 pages of police records and forensic documents would eventually form part of the case materials. Over 100 audio recordings, preserved interviews from different periods, voices changing in sound quality as technology moved from tape to digital files. Each item required review, because a detail that once seemed minor might matter under the new theory. We take the pages in manageable stacks, straightening their corners and reading without haste. The defense was entitled to examine the evidence, challenge the searches, question the scientific methods, and present other possible interpretations. This adversarial process could feel slow, especially to a family that had already waited 26 years, but it belonged to the fairness required in a criminal court. Genetic genealogy was still new in this setting, and its use raised serious questions about privacy and lawful access. You open the first legal motion, where the quiet language of family trees becomes the language of constitutional argument. Downes's attorneys argued that the genealogical search had improperly used the DNA of a relative to identify him without his consent. They questioned whether an individual could have a reasonable expectation of privacy when genetic information shared by one family member revealed connections to another. The state responded that the relative had voluntarily uploaded her information to a service whose database allowed matching under the rules then in place. We read both positions slowly, because new investigative tools often arrive before society has finished deciding their proper limits. The court would have to determine whether the genealogy lead and the evidence derived from it could be used. This question reached beyond the Sergie case, touching anyone whose biological relatives might upload genetic data to a public comparison site. A person can keep their own DNA private and still share inherited segments with someone who chooses differently. You can feel the legal file grow heavier as private family history meets public investigative power. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued rebuilding the human timeline from Bartlett Hall. They returned to Shirley Akelcock, Joanne Sundown, Jolene Nanook, former residents, custodial workers, security personnel, and laboratory employees whose work had touched the evidence. Some witnesses had retired, moved, or changed names, while others carried health and travel limitations. Each conversation required scheduling, preparation, and compassion, because the requested memories led back to a painful spring. The photograph from Murphy Dome came forward again, preserving Sophie beneath the broad Alaska sky, with her arms extended. Another photograph showed her relaxing with reading material on a friend's bed, absorbed in the ordinary comfort of visiting. These images would help jurors understand the person whose name filled the legal documents. As you hold them near the lamp, glossy surfaces catching a soft reflection, Sophie's presence steadies the growing case around her. And when the next set of boxes came down from the shelf, investigators began the longest review yet, matching every new assertion against reports written when the campus snow was still melting. The pages opened flat beneath small weights. Cassette recordings were converted into accessible files, and laboratory notes were arranged in chronological order. Somewhere among those materials lay the voices of young students who were now approaching middle age. You place your headphones gently over your ears and return with them to Bartlett Hall, listening for the first footstep in the corridor. The first footstep belonged not to a suspect, but to the difficult work of reconstructing movement inside a shared building after nearly 3 decades. Students had crossed the corridor for showers, conversations, laundry, and visits, usually without noting the precise time. A sound remembered near 1:30 in the morning might have come before or after that hour, because few people consulted a clock during an ordinary trip to the bathroom. You listen for what the witnesses truly remembered, leaving the uncertain spaces untouched. One former resident, Melanie Segunik, had described seeing a man emerge from the bathtub and shower area during the early morning. She remembered standing near the sinks and watching him pass through the common portion of the bathroom before leaving. Her description did not align neatly with Downes in several physical details, a fact the defense would later emphasize. As you compare the early account with later interviews, you can feel how a single corridor observation can remain important without becoming complete. Years after the original report, investigators showed Segunik a group of photographs and asked whether any resembled the man she remembered. She excluded some and found similarities in others, but she did not identify Downs as the person she had seen. The procedure became another carefully examined part of the record, with lawyers studying wording, timing, and the arrangement of the photographs. We keep the page flat beneath our hand, resisting any urge to make an ambiguous memory more certain than it was. Other witnesses recalled people gathering in rooms, moving between floors, and staying awake later than they usually did on a Sunday night. Their accounts overlapped in places and separated in others, which was natural in a large residence hall. One person remembered clothing, another recalled a conversation, and someone else could place a friend in a general period, but not at an exact minute. You can hear the building again through these modest recollections, doors closing softly within a web of routine. The old recordings sometimes preserved more than words. There were pauses, chairs shifting, distant office sounds, and the slight distortion of tape passing across magnetic heads. A witness might breathe slowly before answering, then correct a phrase or acknowledge not knowing. Those small signs mattered because they revealed thought rather than performance. As we listen beside the lamp, the Sergie case becomes a collection of people trying, imperfectly but sincerely, to return to one night. Prosecutors reviewed those voices while preparing questions that could be answered fairly in court. A witness shouldn't be asked to recreate certainty that never existed, nor should a forgotten detail be supplied through suggestion. Earlier statements could refresh recollection under established rules, yet they could also expose differences that the defense was entitled to explore. You turn from transcript to transcript, noticing how patient questioning keeps the search for truth within bounds. Some witnesses had given repeated accounts over the years, and every repetition created another document to compare. A changed detail might reflect ordinary fading, a misunderstood question, or information encountered after the first interview. It could also carry significance, depending upon its subject and surrounding circumstances. The lawyers had to decide which differences mattered and which merely showed the natural movement of memory across 26 winters. The Sergie evidence box, therefore, contained two kinds of preservation, though only one remained physically unchanged. Biological material held a genetic pattern that could be tested again, while recorded testimony preserved an earlier version of what people recalled. The recordings could not prevent memory from changing, but they allowed later listeners to hear what had been said nearer the time. You place a cassette beside a sealed laboratory packet, recognizing two very different forms of keeping. But before a jury could hear either one, the case had to move from Maine back to Alaska through the formal process of extradition. Downs initially faced proceedings in Maine, while Alaska authorities sought his return to Fairbanks. Courtrooms, filing deadlines, and transportation arrangements added their own slow sequence to the investigation. We follow the documents rather than the journey itself, hearing paper slide beneath a clerk's stamp with a firm, ordinary thump. In May of 2019, Downs waived further opposition to extradition and was transferred to Alaska to face the charges. The flight crossed the continent toward the place where he had once attended university. Though nearly everything about his circumstances had changed, investigators secured the evidence connected with his arrest. while prosecutors began preparing for pre-trial litigation. You can picture the old dormitory photograph waiting in a folder as the legal case returned to Fairbanks. A criminal charge is only the beginning of courtroom work, particularly when the underlying investigation spans several decades. Attorneys need time to review discovery, consult experts, locate witnesses, and challenge evidence they believe was obtained or interpreted improperly. The Sergie case included old forensic methods, newer laboratory analysis, and an emerging genealogy technique whose legal boundaries were still developing. We settle into that slower calendar, where weeks pass between filings and hearings. The defense examined the search warrants used to collect Downes's DNA and search his home. It identified errors in supporting paperwork, including inaccurate information about who had reportedly seen him with a firearm during his university years. Such mistakes required judicial review because warrants depend upon truthful and reliable sworn presentations. You can feel the thin legal pages gather beneath your hand as each side explains whether the remaining information still supplied lawful cause. The court considered whether the errors undermined the warrants or whether sufficient independent facts supported them. Judges approached these questions through testimony, written motions, prior decisions, and the exact sequence by which investigators developed the lead. Nothing about the process resembled a quick answer produced by machinery. We watch counsel place binders on a wooden table, their tabs bright against cream-colored paper, while the air carries the faint scent of varnish. The genetic genealogy search drew especially close attention. Downes's relative had uploaded her consumer DNA data under an alias, hoping to locate family connections through GED match. Investigators had used the resulting partial match to construct a path toward him. Though he had never uploaded his own profile, the defense argued that this process reached private genetic information without proper authority, raising a question that extended well beyond one case. The state maintained that the relative had voluntarily placed her information into a comparison system operating under its rules at the time. It also emphasized that genealogy had generated only an investigative lead, which officers then confirmed through a court-authorized collection and conventional forensic comparison. The distinction between finding a candidate and proving a laboratory match became central. As you trace those two stages, the legal issue remains complex even when the scientific sequence appears orderly. The judge ultimately allowed the DNA evidence to proceed, rejecting the request to suppress it. This ruling did not prevent the defense from questioning the genealogy process before trial or from challenging the meaning of the direct match. It determined that the prosecution could present the evidence under the court's interpretation of the law. You mark the ruling date in the margin, aware that a new investigative method was slowly acquiring a legal history of its own. Other hearings addressed possible alternative suspects, the admissibility of witness accounts, and how much background the jury could hear. The defense proposed several people whom it believed deserved consideration, while the court required a sufficient evidentiary connection before allowing a name to be presented. This safeguarded against unsupported suspicion being transferred to absent individuals. We listen as the judge narrows the field, not to make the story cleaner, but to keep the proceeding fair. 3 alternative suspects were eventually permitted for discussion at trial. Each had appeared somewhere in the long history of the case, through witness recollection, proximity, reported statements, or possession of a possible weapon type. Their DNA did not match the central male profile, but the defense argued that the original investigation had not excluded every possible scenario. You arranged their files separately, allowing the jury's future task to remain broad enough for doubt. Then the calendar itself changed, and the case encountered a delay no investigator had anticipated. The worldwide pandemic disrupted courts, restricted travel, and made large indoor proceedings difficult or impossible for extended periods. Witnesses, who had already waited decades now, had to wait longer, while attorneys continued preparing through remote meetings and electronic filings. You can imagine the courthouse corridors unusually quiet, with dark hearing rooms holding empty chairs beneath a film of stillness. The delay did not send the evidence back into dormancy, though it added more time to the Sergie case. Laboratory materials remained secured, discovery continued to be organized, and legal questions moved through hearings whenever conditions allowed. Some witnesses would eventually appear by video rather than travel to Fairbanks. We watch another winter gather on the courthouse windows, knowing that patience has once again become part of the method. By early 2022, preparations had reached the point where a jury trial could begin. Public health precautions shaped the courtroom, with masks, remote testimony, restricted seating, and video access for observers. The technology gave distant witnesses a way to appear while preserving a record of the proceedings. You can hear the soft electronic tone as a remote connection opens, followed by a clerk asking whether the witness can hear the court. On the 12th of January, the trial began in Fairbanks Superior Court before Judge Thomas Temple. Downs sat with his attorneys, while prosecutors arranged exhibits and notes across their tables. Jurors entered, carrying no responsibility to solve the mystery historically, but a narrower duty to decide whether the state proved its charges beyond a reasonable doubt. We take our seat quietly behind them, with the Sergie evidence box now translated into numbered exhibits. Opening statements gave each side an opportunity to describe the evidence it expected the jury to hear. The prosecution presented the DNA match as the stable line connecting Downs to Sophie, and emphasized his denial that he had ever known her. The defense urged caution, pointing to weaknesses in the original inquiry, alternative possibilities, and the absence of other physical evidence identifying him. You listen to both without selecting a rhythm of urgency, because the courtroom's work depends upon attention. The jurors would hear approximately 5 weeks of proceedings, including testimony from around 45 witnesses and more than 100 exhibits. Many witnesses had been young adults in 1993 and now appeared with decades of life visible in their faces and voices. Their memories reached backward across marriages, careers, relocations, and family changes. As each person took the oath, you could almost feel time settling into the witness chair. Sophie's friends came first to restore the weekend that the investigation had reduced to dates and movements. They spoke of her happiness, responsibility, and closeness to the people she loved. Photographs showed her reading in a dormitory room and extending her arms outdoors near Murphy Dome. We look with the jurors, letting the quiet grain of the old images carry Sophie's presence before any technical testimony begins. Joanne Sundown recalled spending time with Sophie and helping her reach the hairdresser. She remembered catalogues, conversation, and the group outing beyond Fairbanks, where a photograph captured Sophie, turning beneath the open sky. The details were domestic and friendly, which was precisely why they mattered. You hear the rustle of a paper exhibit being passed forward, and the courtroom briefly seems to hold the pale northern light of that Sunday. Jolene Nanook also spoke about the photographs from the evening and the sense that Sophie was enjoying herself. She remembered offering Sophie another place to stay, though Sophie intended to attend her orthodontic appointment before traveling home. That appointment remained one of the simplest anchors in the timeline. We place it beside the airline journey and dormitory visit, seeing a young woman arranging a short trip around a practical promise. Shirley Ackelcock described the room in Bartlett Hall, where Sophie was supposed to sleep. She recalled pizza, soda, the television, and her suggestion that Sophie use the bathtub area to smoke because the weather outside was cold. She also remembered returning later to find the bed apparently unused and the room largely as she had left it. You can smell the faint cardboard of a pizza box as ordinary hospitality becomes part of an enduring record. During later questioning, Shirley spoke about people she recalled seeing near the stairwell when she left. The memory had emerged or become more specific across the years, and the defense examined that timing closely. She was shown a photograph from the university period and associated Downs with one of the people present. We keep the earlier interviews beside the later identification, allowing the difference to remain visible rather than quietly resolved. This was a recurring pattern during the trial, because the prosecution and defense often agreed about what a witness said, but disagreed about how much trust to place in it. A recollection strengthened by later review could be sincere while still being vulnerable to time. A missing detail in an early interview could mean it wasn't remembered then, or merely that no one asked the right question. You sit with that uncertainty, which is less comfortable than certainty, but often more honest. Former dormitory residents described the design of Bartlett Hall, including the division of floors, the stairwells, and the bathroom arrangement. Photographs and diagrams helped jurors place each remembered movement within the building. The walls in the images carried institutional paint, while fixtures reflected the direct light common to shared facilities. As you follow the floor plan with one finger, the spaces become clear without becoming dramatic. The second floor housed women, while a men's floor was located above it, and other living areas extended through the building. Residents and visitors sometimes moved between floors, so assignment did not equal confinement. Downes's third-floor room placed him close to the bathroom, but did not establish his location during the critical period. We keep proximity in its measured place, a contextual fact awaiting connection with stronger evidence. Witnesses also described the social life of the residence hall near the end of the academic year. People watched films, gathered in rooms, drank, talked, and wandered between friends while preparing for examinations and summer departures. The building was neither deserted nor continuously observed. You can hear a television through one wall and music through another, sounds that make exact reconstruction more difficult because ordinary noise can conceal the source of a remembered moment. Downes's former girlfriend, Catherine de Schweinitz-Lee, testified about their relationship and the night in question. Her memory of the specific evening had faded, though earlier accounts and surrounding details offered some points of reference. She could not confirm that Downes remained with her throughout the night, and she described him as moving in and out during gatherings. We listen gently, understanding that a witness may care deeply about accuracy while being unable to recover every hour. She also recalled an occasion when Downs had access to a small firearm during their university years, though she believed it may have been borrowed. Another former friend offered a somewhat different recollection about firearms associated with him. These accounts were relevant because investigators had recovered evidence involving a small caliber weapon, but no particular gun was forensically identified. You lay the testimony beside the ballistics report, where possibility remains separate from proof. Nicholas Daze's testimony returned the court to his 2010 interview. He described his friendship with Downs, their earlier rooming arrangement, and the weapons he remembered Downs possessing. The defense explored inconsistencies and the long interval before those memories were recorded. We hear the courtroom microphone pick up a quiet swallow and the movement of papers, small reminders that testimony comes through human bodies carrying time. Dazer had also served as a student security guard and helped protect the area after Sophie was discovered. That role placed him close to the early investigation and later made his own history a subject of scrutiny. His DNA was collected and did not match the profile at the center of the case. As you turn to the exclusion report, its clean printed lines separate his genetic identity from the material that had waited in storage. Melanie Segunik then described seeing a man leave the bathtub area in the early morning. Her remembered description included features that differed from Downs's appearance, and she had not identified him in a photographic procedure. The prosecution and defense asked about lighting, distance, duration, and the years separating the sighting from trial. We stand quietly at the imagined sink beside her, hearing water run while a brief observation passes into memory. The jurors were not asked to disregard the differences. Instead, they had to decide how the sighting fit with the rest of the evidence, including whether the person observed was connected to Sophie at all. Shared facilities can contain several people during one night, and a witness may see someone before or after the significant event. You place no extra meaning into the doorway, allowing the account to remain a short and incomplete glimpse. But the next witnesses brought the trial back to the first afternoon, when custodial staff entered the bathroom during routine cleaning. Okcha and Cheta testified remotely, recalling how duties were divided and how she approached the shower and bathtub room. Her work partner attended to another portion of the bathroom while she followed the familiar pattern of her shift. You hear the cartwheels again, the soft splash of cleaning water, and then the abrupt change from routine to discovery. Even after so many years, her account preserved the practical details of employment. She knew which areas she normally cleaned, how the room was arranged, and whom she contacted after realizing assistance was needed. The prosecution did not need to linger on distressing visual details to establish that the scene had been found and reported. We remain with the procedural sequence, following the call from custodial work into official response, and university security personnel and early investigators described restricting access and beginning documentation. They testified about photographs, evidence markers, sketches, and the challenge of managing a scene inside an occupied dormitory. Students still needed guidance, staff needed information, and investigators required space to work without contamination. You can smell the cool tiled room and the faint chemical trace of cleaning supplies while an officer writes the first entry in the scene log. Retired investigators returned to decisions made under the pressure and limitations of 1993. Some acknowledged that staffing was strained and that the approaching end of the semester complicated efforts to locate every student. People were preparing to leave campus, and interviews had to be arranged quickly. We hear no excuse in these facts, only context for why an enormous task unfolded unevenly through notebooks, telephone calls, and hurried directories. The defense questioned gaps in the early work, including people who were not interviewed promptly, and physical items that produced no clear identification. It argued that the original investigation had become confused and that later detectives focused too heavily on Downs after the genealogy result. The prosecution answered that imperfect procedures did not change the preserved DNA or his denial of contact. You hold both arguments in view, recognizing that real investigations rarely arrive in court without roughness. Crime scene specialists explained the collection of fingerprints, hairs, fibers, impressions, and biological materials. Most of those items never acquired a meaningful connection to Downs, and some pointed nowhere conclusive at all. This was not unusual in a shared residence hall, where many people and materials pass through common spaces. As you examine the evidence lists, you feel the accumulation of envelopes and lift tape, each carefully marked despite its uncertain future. Fingerprints can be especially limited in a place touched by many residents. A clear print may belong to an innocent user of the room, while a relevant person may leave no recoverable impression. Surfaces, moisture, pressure, and later contact all affect what remains. The fingerprint experts described these limits without diminishing the value of their work, and you can almost feel the black powder's fine texture settling across a demonstration surface. Hair and fiber evidence carried similar constraints. Microscopic comparison could describe color, structure, or consistency, but it could not always identify one unique person, particularly under the methods available in the early 1990s. Later DNA testing might help with some hairs if suitable biological material remained, though not every strand contained enough. We look through the imagined microscope, where a single fiber fills the field of view, yet still refuses a definite name. Ballistics witnesses addressed the small projectile recovered during Sophie's examination. Its condition prevented a reliable match to one particular firearm, even when investigators later recovered small-caliber weapons from Downs's home. General characteristics could narrow possibilities without identifying a single source. You hear a metal evidence container placed gently on the witness table, a light sound that carries less certainty than its physical solidity might suggest. These limitations formed a quiet counterpoint to the biological evidence. Prints, fibers, hairs, and ballistics remained inconclusive, while the preserved male DNA produced a direct match after 26 years. The jury had to consider whether that contrast strengthened the DNA's importance or highlighted the absence of corroborating physical links. We do not answer for them, but we understand why each laboratory witness was asked to define the exact reach of their finding. Forensic biologists then described the samples collected during Sophie's examination and the sequence of testing across the decades. Early technicians had prepared swabs, gauze, smears, and slides, documenting their work before placing materials into storage. Later analysts used portions of those preserved items to develop the unknown profile. You can see the handwritten exhibit numbers passing from an older worksheet into a newer computer report, a slender line of continuity. One analyst explained DNA as a biological blueprint. though the courtroom discussion focused on selected markers rather than an entire genome. At each tested location, the unknown sample carried values that could be compared with Downes's known profile. The correspondence extended across the required markers, producing a statistical result strongly supporting that he was the source. We watched the chart appear on a screen, rows and columns replacing the vast family tree with a precise comparison. The prosecution carefully separated the investigative genealogy work from the confirmatory laboratory test. GED match and family tree research had directed officers toward Downes, but the courtroom identification rested upon traditional forensic testing of his legally collected cheek swab. This distinction helped jurors understand why a relative's uploaded profile was not itself the final evidence of identity. You draw two quiet arrows on our notes, one labeled lead and the other confirmation. C.C. Moore explained how the genealogy search had unfolded. She described the SNP profile, shared DNA segments, relationship estimates, and the documentary work used to build the relevant maternal family line. The jurors saw how an aunt's partial match could eventually point toward her sister's son when age, sex, ancestry, and location were considered. We follow the branches with them, hearing the faint ventilation of the courtroom while generations spread across the display. Moore's work did not begin with Downes's name and search backward for support. It began with anonymous genetic relationships and moved through documented family structures until a plausible candidate emerged. That order mattered because it reduced the risk of forcing the tree toward a predetermined conclusion. Still, the defense questioned privacy, database rules, and the possibility of mistaken family assumptions. You keep the branch lines visible, while the competing interpretations pass calmly through the record. An expert can explain shared centimorgans, chromosome segments, and estimated cousin ranges, but genealogy remains partly an exercise in patient historical research. Obituaries may list siblings, public records may establish residences, and social information may confirm relationships not obvious from official forms. Each source contains possible errors, which is why multiple paths are checked. You can smell old newsprint in an imagined archive, while a cursor moves through newer digital records. The aunt's profile shared numerous segments with the unknown contributor, enough to indicate a genuine biological relationship rather than coincidence. From the structure of her family, Moore narrowed the possible line and identified Downes as fitting the known circumstances. His residence at Bartlett Hall was not encoded in DNA. It came from separate records that joined the genetic inference to Fairbanks. We placed those sources beside each other, seeing how independent forms of information became aligned. The defense asked whether another relative could have shared similar genetic characteristics. Moore acknowledged the relationship ranges and explained how documentary facts narrowed the candidates. The direct cheek swab comparison then resolved the question of which individual supplied the old forensic profile. You can hear a quiet page turn after that answer, because the genealogy no longer stands alone once conventional analysis reaches the same person. Other laboratory witnesses discussed contamination safeguards and the history of the samples. The defense explored whether handling over many years could have introduced material or caused a mix-up. Analysts reviewed labels, controls, custody records, and the consistency of testing results produced at different times. We inspect the sealed edges and initials with them. Understanding The preservation must be demonstrated through records rather than simply assumed. Contamination might add an unintended profile, but it would still require an explanation for why that profile matched a man who lived in the same dormitory when Sophie died. A labeling error would likewise need to account for the continuity between original collection records and later tests. The prosecution emphasized those surrounding facts, while the defense pressed every procedural weakness it could identify. You listen to the exchange without an energy spike, letting method answer method in a steady cadence. A defense DNA expert addressed another sample containing limited male genetic material that did not appear consistent with Downs. The amount was small, and the parties disagreed about what could safely be inferred from it. Shared environments and incidental transfer can produce trace profiles whose time and circumstances are unknown. We place that report beside the central sample rather than beneath it, because separate biological findings may have separate origins. This distinction prevented the case from becoming a simple claim that every male trace belonged to one person. Human beings move through rooms, touch surfaces, share clothing, and carry material from one place to another. Forensic interpretation depends upon where a sample was found, how much was present, and what activity might explain it. As our eyes grow comfortable in the lamplight, we see why location and context matter as much as the genetic letters themselves. The central profile came from material whose placement and character the prosecution argued were directly connected with the assault. Downes's repeated denial of ever meeting Sophie left no acknowledged innocent contact to explain it. The defense suggested that an encounter could have occurred despite his failure to remember or admit it, and argued that DNA alone could not establish every surrounding event. You hold the interview transcript beside the laboratory chart, where words and biology remain in quiet conflict. Recordings of Downes's interviews were played for the jury. His voice described his university life, his relationship at the time, and his belief that he had been in his girlfriend's room. When shown Sophie's image, he said he did not know her and had never had contact with her. The courtroom listened to nearly 2 hours of recorded conversation, with pauses and room tone preserved just as they had been captured in Maine. After investigators disclosed the DNA finding, Downes proposed laboratory error or some unknown mistake. He did not offer a remembered meeting that might account for the profile. Prosecutors treated the denial as important evidence because it removed the possibility of consensual contact from his own account. The defense urged jurors not to equate an inability to explain old DNA with proof of murder, and we note the distinction in careful script. The jury also heard evidence about Downes's movements and later life, though the court kept the focus on relevant facts. He had completed his education, worked in several fields, and eventually became a nurse in Maine. The passing decades contained no public accusation connecting him to Sophie until the genealogy search. You look again at the evidence box, realizing that its contents retained an old connection, while the people around it accumulated entirely new histories. Alternative suspect testimony required another patient return to the earlier investigation. One individual had reportedly made or been associated with troubling statements, while another had possessed a small caliber firearm and left the campus around the relevant period. A third had been seen as a possible resemblance in an old photographic procedure. The defense argued that these paths had not been resolved adequately. and you open their folders without assuming that suspicion equals evidence. Prosecutors responded with exclusions, contradictory accounts, and the absence of a matching biological profile. They emphasized that none of the permitted alternative suspects matched the central DNA, while Downs did. The defense maintained that more than one person could have been involved, or that the DNA might reflect a separate encounter. We allow those possibilities to be spoken fully, because a jury's confidence must survive reasonable alternatives rather than simply ignore them. One alternative suspect testified and denied involvement, explaining earlier statements differently from the way they had been reported. Another witness described a former roommate who possessed a small revolver and disappeared from his usual campus routine shortly before or after the relevant time. Yet no weapon was tied conclusively to Sophie's case, and no corresponding DNA match emerged. You can hear the quiet frustration of paths that open briefly and then lose their footing. The defense's larger criticism concerned the original investigation's disorder. Bartlett Hall contained many possible witnesses, the semester was ending, and investigators faced pressure to identify residents before they scattered. Some interviews were incomplete, some people were reached only much later, and certain records contained errors. We run a finger across an early contact sheet, where crossed-out telephone numbers and hurried handwriting preserve the practical difficulty of scope. The prosecution did not claim the 1993 inquiry had been flawless. Instead, it asked jurors to separate correctable shortcomings from the evidence that remained reliable. The samples had been collected, preserved, profiled, and eventually matched, while Downs had lived nearby and denied any contact with Sophie. You sit between the two tables as each side returns to the same facts through a different lens. Over 15 days of testimony, the jurors accumulated their own thick collection of notes. They heard friends speak warmly about Sophie, investigators explain old decisions, and scientists translate microscopic patterns into ordinary language. They also heard challenges to memory, procedure, legality, and interpretation. The process remained slow by design, allowing the evidence box to be unpacked in public, one carefully numbered piece at a time. Masks covered much of each face, and remote witnesses appeared inside a rectangle of light. These conditions could have made the proceedings feel distant, yet voices still carried the weight of personal recollection. A friend speaking from another city could hold up an old photograph or look down while searching for a date. You sense the slight delay of the video connection, then the patient pause before the next question. By the beginning of February, the witness list had shortened and the exhibit table had grown crowded. Attorneys revisited earlier testimony while deciding what remaining proof needed clarification. The courtroom windows admitted pale winter daylight, though much of the work continued beneath even fluorescent illumination. We return each morning with the jurors, hearing coats brush against seat backs and paper cups settle into discreet corners. When the final witnesses stepped down, both sides prepared closing arguments from the same large record. Closing arguments are not evidence, but they help jurors understand how each side believes the evidence fits together. Prosecutors arranged a chronology from Sophie's arrival through the DNA confirmation, while defense counsel organized the gaps and competing possibilities. You watch colored tabs multiply along binder edges, each one marking a route back into the testimony. The prosecution returned first to Sophie's purpose in Fairbanks. She had come for an orthodontic appointment, visited close friends, and expected to sleep in Shirley's room before traveling home. Her friends described no secret social life that would explain contact with Downs, and Downs himself denied knowing her. The state placed the laboratory match against those facts, asking the jury to consider the absence of any innocent explanation within the trial record. It also emphasized the preservation of the sample across 26 winters. Technicians in 1993 could not have known genetic genealogy would identify a candidate in 2018, nor could they have manufactured his residence in Bartlett Hall. The chain of events depended upon methods developed years apart and records held by different institutions. As you listen, the Sergie evidence box seems less like a single object than a long corridor of custody. The defense returned to the limitations of the case. It noted the lack of a weapon match, the absence of fingerprints or fibers pointing to Downs, the uncertain eyewitness descriptions, and the incomplete early investigation. It argued that biological contact did not by itself explain precisely when or how that contact occurred. You hear the pages turn more quickly during argument, though the voices remain governed by the formal calm of the courtroom. Defense counsel also warned against allowing the power of DNA language to overshadow uncertainty elsewhere. A source-level match can identify whose biological material is present, but it doesn't independently narrate every action surrounding that material. The jury had to decide whether the location, Sophie's circumstances, Downs's denial, and other evidence supplied the missing context beyond reasonable doubt. We underline the phrase context because it carries much of the case's legal weight. The prosecution answered that the central sample could not reasonably be separated from the events in the bathroom, particularly when Downs insisted he had never encountered Sophie. It acknowledged that no case approaching 30 years old would arrive without faded memories and unresolved traces. Yet it argued that the most important physical evidence had remained clear. You can feel the stillness of the room as the final chart is lowered and the attorneys return to their seats. Judge Temple then instructed the jurors on the law governing the charges: reasonable doubt, witness credibility, expert testimony, and the proper use of circumstantial evidence. These instructions gave them no answer about the facts. Instead, they provided a structure for evaluating what they had heard. We listen carefully to each definition, the judge's measured voice replacing argument with a neutral set of rules. The jurors carried exhibits and notes into the deliberation room, where a long table waited beneath ordinary ceiling lights. They could request recordings, review reports, and ask to hear portions of testimony again through established procedures. No one outside the room knew which question they would take up first. You can imagine coats folded over chairbacks, pencils beside legal pads, and the low sound of ventilation accompanying their private work. Their task was not to reward persistence or correct every weakness in the old investigation. It was to determine whether the state had met its burden against Stephen Downs on the evidence admitted at trial. The 26 winters explained how the case reached them, but time itself proved nothing. We leave the calendar at the door and follow only the exhibits as they move around the deliberation table. Perhaps they began with the DNA chart, placing it beside the interview in which Downs denied knowing Sophie. Perhaps they turned first to the dormitory map or to the testimony of her friends. We cannot know the exact order, and there is no need to invent it. You sit beyond the closed door with the rest of the courtroom. allowing the jurors the unhurried privacy their duty requires. Inside, the old evidence no longer waited alone on a shelf. It was handled through gloves, photographs, reports, testimony, cross-examination, and the written instructions of the court. Every item had traveled from collection to storage, from storage to renewed testing, and from testing into a public record. You can hear a binder open again as one juror returns to the first laboratory worksheet, following the handwritten exhibit number toward the newer genetic profile. The match remains the same on every review, but its meaning must be considered alongside everything around it. One juror may focus on the denied acquaintance, while another examines the possibility of unremembered contact. Someone may return to the eyewitness description, and another may study the chain of custody. Their conversation proceeds not as a dramatic contest, but as the patient comparison of doubts against facts. Outside the deliberation room, Sophie's family and friends waited through another interval, whose length they could not control. They had waited for investigators, databases, laboratories, courts, and travel arrangements. And now they waited for 12 people to complete their careful discussion. The courthouse air felt dry from winter heating, and shoes made subdued sounds across the polished floor. We remained nearby without guessing, holding Sophie's photograph beneath the soft light. The attorneys waited as well, reviewing notes or speaking quietly, though their formal work was temporarily complete. Investigators who had carried the Sergie file through its later years could do nothing further to influence the decision. The sealed evidence rested under court control, its long period of silent possibility now transformed into testimony the jurors had heard. You feel the stillness after so much preparation, a stillness made not of emptiness, but of concentrated thought. At some point, the jurors asked to review portions of the record and returned again to their discussion. The legal pads before them filled with references, questions, and perhaps simple marks beside the elements they were required to consider. A clock moved across the afternoon without announcing urgency. We sit with that quiet movement, because even here, after nearly 3 decades, the Sophie Sergie case still asks to be handled one line at a time. I'm continuing through the verdict, sentencing, and the next life of the evidence file, keeping the legal status and dates accurate without turning this portion into an ending. On the 4th day of deliberations, after roughly 20 hours of private discussion, the jurors sent word that they had reached unanimous decisions. The message traveled from the deliberation room to the judge, then outward to attorneys and those waiting nearby. People returned to their places, adjusted papers, and faced the bench beneath the even courtroom light. You can hear chairs settle softly as the long record enters another moment. Judge Thomas Temple received the verdict forms and read them aloud shortly after 10:30 on the morning of the 10th of February, 2022. The jury found Stephen Harris Downs guilty of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault in the case of Sophie Sergie. The language was formal, containing the count, the name represented in court by initials, and the date signed by the foreperson. We hear no flourish in those words, only the measured finding of 12 people. The judge then asked each juror individually whether the announced verdicts reflected that person's decision. One after another, the jurors confirmed that they did, establishing the required unanimity. Their voices would have differed in pitch and volume, though each answer carried the same legal meaning. You remain seated beside the file as the poll proceeds, understanding that even a completed verdict must be checked through a careful process. For Sophie's family, the ruling arrived after nearly 29 years without a conviction and almost 26 years before an identified suspect. The courtroom decision could answer who was legally responsible, but it could not return the life interrupted in 1993. Relief and grief, therefore, occupied the same space, neither cancelling the other. We look again at Sophie's photograph, where her arms remain extended beneath the Murphy Dome sky. Downs was 47 years old when the jury convicted him, almost 3 decades older than the freshman who had lived in Bartlett Hall. He continued to maintain his innocence, and his attorneys prepared to challenge the verdict through the procedures available after trial. The judge ordered him held, while the case moved toward sentencing. You can hear a courtroom door close after the parties leave, while the numbered exhibits remain under secure custody. The jurors departed without publicly describing the path of their discussion. We know how long they deliberated and what verdicts they returned, but not which exhibit first persuaded them, or which uncertainty required the most conversation. That privacy belongs to the jury room, unless jurors later choose to speak. As the detective tonight, you don't invent what the record does not preserve, so their 20 hours remain respectfully private. The DNA evidence was clearly central, though the verdict reflected the full trial record rather than a single laboratory chart. Jurors had heard Downs deny meeting Sophie, learned that he lived 1 floor above the relevant bathroom, and reviewed the long preservation history of the sample. They had also heard the defense's objections, alternate possibilities, and criticism of the first investigation. The unanimous finding meant those challenges had not created reasonable doubt for the jury. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited in winter clothing, while community members absorbed the news through radio, television, and telephone calls. Fairbanks held the pale brightness of February, with snow compacted along sidewalks and breath briefly visible in the cold air. The case that had rested in boxes for decades was now being spoken about across Alaska. You can almost hear boots pressing into dry snow as people gather with quiet purpose. A community vigil was organized for the following day in front of the Rabinowitz courthouse. Alaska Native organizations joined local partners in creating a place to remember Sophie and acknowledge the wider concern for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The gathering centered her life, rather than the defendant's name. We stand at the edge of the winter crowd, where scarves cover faces and a light wind moves through signs held in gloved hands. Public language often uses the word closure after a long-awaited verdict, though families may experience something more complicated. A legal answer can close one question while leaving the absence itself unchanged. Sophie's relatives had continued without her through birthdays, family gatherings, illnesses, celebrations, and countless ordinary days never entered into evidence. You hold that distinction gently, recognizing that justice and healing don't always travel at the same speed. Investigators who had worked the case also received the verdict through the lens of years spent among its records. For Randall McFerrin and others in the cold case unit, the ruling confirmed that the genealogy lead and conventional DNA match had survived courtroom testing. Earlier detectives and laboratory personnel could see how their work had carried forward. We turn to the first evidence log again, where an old signature now connects with the jury's decision. The custodial workers who discovered Sophie, the technicians who sealed samples, and the clerks who maintained storage had not known what their actions would eventually support. Most had performed tasks that seemed procedural rather than historic. Yet a missing label, broken custody record, or discarded sample could have changed everything. You feel the evidence box's softened corner and understand how routine care can outlast the people who first provide it. But the verdict did not end the courtroom work, and within days, the defense filed motions asking for an acquittal or a new trial. Such motions allow a judge to review whether the evidence legally supported the verdict and whether claimed errors affected the fairness of the proceedings. The papers returned familiar arguments in a more concentrated form. We open the new filing beneath our lamp, where fresh white pages rest against folders browned slightly by age. The defense argued that the prosecution had not established enough evidence beyond the DNA connection, and that jurors may have relied upon improper or unsupported inferences. It challenged portions of the state's closing argument, the treatment of alternative suspect evidence, and other trial rulings. Each claim required the judge to examine the record against legal standards different from the jury's factual task. You can hear computer keys tapping as citations and transcript references accumulate into another brief. One disputed issue involved recorded statements from a woman who had implicated her brother, Kenneth Moto, during an earlier investigation. She died before the trial, so the defense could not call her for live testimony or cross-examination. The judge had excluded portions of her recorded account under the rules governing hearsay, while allowing the defense to present other evidence concerning Moto. We place the recording beside the ruling, seeing how courtroom reliability rules can keep seemingly relevant material beyond the jury's hearing. The defense viewed that exclusion as especially important because it believed the statement supported an alternative explanation. The state argued that the account lacked the legal safeguards required for admission, and that Moto's own DNA did not match the central forensic profile. These positions would later reappear in the appeal. For now, you follow them through the post-trial motion, where the same old tape acquires a new layer of argument. Another dispute concerned a prosecution warning during closing argument about drawing unsupported conclusions from evidence associated with one alternative suspect. Defense attorneys said the state's characterization came too late and unfairly affected their theory. The judge reviewed what had been said, what evidence supported it, and whether any resulting problem justified setting aside the verdict. We listened to the recorded closing again, not for tone, but for the exact words preserved by the court. In late March of 2022, Judge Temple denied the requests for acquittal and a new trial. He found that the evidence was legally sufficient and that the defense had not shown grounds requiring the verdicts to be disturbed. This ruling kept the convictions in place and moved the case towards sentencing. You file the order behind the verdict forms, its crisp pages marking another completed stage. Sentencing required its own preparation because the court needed information about Sophie, her family, the defendant, and the law in effect when the crimes occurred. The passage of nearly 3 decades complicated this task, as the judge had to apply sentencing provisions from 1993 rather than simply using current rules. Attorneys proposed different terms and presented arguments about aggravating and mitigating considerations. We return to the calendar once more, where old law meets a newer courtroom. A presentence report gathered verified information about Downes's life, education, work, criminal history, and circumstances since the university years. His defense described the decades during which he had not accumulated a comparable record of serious criminal conduct. Prosecutors focused on the severity of the offenses and the permanent loss imposed upon Sophie's family. You turn through the report carefully, aware that sentencing asks a judge to consider an entire person without losing sight of another. The defense requested a substantially lower period of imprisonment than the state sought. It argued that Downes had built a productive adult life, maintained relationships, and gone many years without another violent conviction. Downes continued to assert that he was innocent. We hear these points as part of the required process, not as a reduction of Sophie's value, because a lawful sentence must consider both the offense and the individual standing before the court. The prosecution asked for a lengthy term reflecting first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault under Alaska law. It describes Sophie as a young woman whose autonomy, future, and family relationships had been taken from her. Prosecutors also emphasized that Downes had avoided accountability for nearly 3 decades while her relatives waited for an answer. You feel the courtroom air grow still, though the speaker's cadence remains controlled. Victim impact statements offered Sophie's family a place to describe what legal documents could not. They could speak about who she had been, what her absence meant, and how the long uncertainty affected the people who loved her. These statements were not another attempt to prove guilt, because the jury had already decided that question. They helped the judge understand the continuing human cost beyond the numbered charges. Sophie's brother, Alexei, intended to participate by telephone from Western Alaska, though the connection was lost before he could complete the planned statement. The failed call was a small practical difficulty within a case long shaped by Alaska's distances. A voice traveling from a remote community depends upon equipment, signal, and timing that a courtroom cannot always control. We listen to the empty line for a moment, feeling the distance as a faint electronic silence. Even when a statement cannot be delivered as intended, the relationship behind it remains present. Alexei was the brother whose Navy service had helped inspire Sophie's own interest, and whose clothing she had borrowed during her Fairbanks visit. Family memories don't require admission as exhibits to be real. You close your eyes briefly and hear river wind near Pitcairn's Point, far from the courthouse's dry heated air. On the 26th of September 2022, Judge Temple imposed sentence in the Rabinowitz courthouse. He ordered 67 years for the first-degree murder conviction and 8 additional years for the first-degree sexual assault conviction. The terms were consecutive, producing a total sentence of 75 years. We hear the numbers spoken slowly, each one carrying legal precision rather than dramatic weight. The judge explained that no court action could restore what had been taken from Sophie and her family. He spoke of her value as a person and the years of life her relatives were denied with her. The sentence addressed punishment, public protection, and other established goals, but it could not undo April of 1993. You sit beside Sophie's family as the judge acknowledges that fundamental limit. Under the applicable rules, Downes could seek discretionary release after serving a portion of the sentence, generally 25 years if other requirements were met. That possibility did not guarantee release, because a later decision would depend upon the legal process and circumstances then existing. The court also imposed the registration requirements associated with the conviction. We note these provisions plainly, keeping administrative detail inside the same patient record. Downs was approaching 50 when sentenced, so the term extended far beyond the ordinary horizon of his working life. His defense continued to maintain his innocence and indicated that appellate issues would follow. The courtroom case had reached judgment, but the legal file remained open for review by higher courts. You hear another clerk stamp another page, and the Sergie evidence box begins a different kind of waiting. The trial exhibits returned to controlled storage or remained secured according to court procedure. Biological material retained value because future litigation might require independent review or renewed testing. Recordings, photographs, and reports also had to remain accessible while appeals were possible. We watch an evidence custodian check numbers against a list, then close a container whose tape makes a dry pulling sound. This post-conviction preservation carries the same quiet logic that protected the case during its unsolved years. A verdict does not make careful custody unnecessary because defendants retain rights to challenge evidence and courts may order further proceedings. The state must be able to show what was tested, what remains, and where each item traveled. You return the box to a shelf, though now its label connects to both a cold case and a completed trial. The notice of appeal shifted attention from factual reconstruction toward legal review. Appellate judges would not ordinarily retry the case or hear every witness again. They would examine the record for claimed errors, consider written arguments, and determine whether the trial court applied the law correctly. We move from the witness chair to a quieter table covered with transcripts, where no new memory is needed and every spoken word has become text. Preparing an appellate record for a 5-week trial requires sustained clerical care. Audio, exhibits, orders, motions, and thousands of transcript pages must be indexed so lawyers and judges can locate the same passage. A page citation that points to the wrong volume wastes time and can obscure an argument. You can hear the whisper of thin transcript paper as legal assistants verify one reference after another. The genealogy issue remained among the most significant questions. Downs had never placed his DNA into GED match, yet his relative's voluntary upload gave investigators a biological route toward him. His attorneys argued that using those shared segments invaded a protected privacy interest and that the resulting evidence should have been suppressed. We trace the inherited segments again, now not as investigative clues, but as objects of constitutional debate. The state answered that the search examined information another person had chosen to make available through the genealogy service. It also argued that Downs could not claim a personal privacy right in his aunt's uploaded profile, and that later warrants independently authorized the collection of his own DNA. The legal question, therefore, involved consent, shared biology, public exposure, and the relationship between an investigative lead and confirmed evidence. You feel several doctrines meet beneath one deceptively simple family tree. Privacy becomes unusual when the information at issue is inherited. A person can conceal an address, destroy a letter, or decline to publish a photograph, but genetic relatives naturally carry overlapping segments. One relative's choice can reveal family relationships that others never chose to disclose. As we sit with the Sergie appeal, we see why investigative genealogy brings both extraordinary usefulness and serious ethical questions. The law must decide not only whether a technique works, but under what conditions the government may use it. Accuracy doesn't resolve authority, and public benefit doesn't automatically erase personal privacy. Courts examine expectations, terms of service, voluntary disclosure, warrants, and the precise actions investigators took. You turn these concepts slowly beneath the lamp, hearing distant courthouse ventilation and the muted scratch of a judge's pen. The appellate argument also returned to the excluded recording involving Kenneth Moto's sister. The defense contended that jurors should have heard her statement because it supported an alternative suspect. The state maintained that the recording was unreliable hearsay and that other evidence concerning Moto had been presented. We placed the cassette's digital copy beside the evidentiary rule, where a human accusation waits behind a legal threshold. Another issue concerned whether the trial evidence as a whole supported the convictions. The defense continued to characterize the case as resting too heavily upon DNA, without enough independent proof of how the material came to be present. The state relied upon the sample's context, Downes's denial of any relationship with Sophie, his location in Bartlett Hall, and the surrounding timeline. You recognize the same two interpretations that face the jury, now translated into appellate standards. Appellate judges approach sufficiency claims with defined rules about how the trial evidence must be viewed. They usually do not replace the jury's credibility decisions simply because another interpretation could be imagined. The question is whether a reasonable juror could reach the verdict under the required burden. We read that standard twice, because legal review often turns upon the shape of a question rather than the emotional force of an answer. While briefs were prepared, the case continued to influence cold case practice in Alaska. Investigators had already used genetic genealogy in other long unsolved cases, drawing upon lessons about sample quality, family tree research, and confirmatory testing. Sophie's case became an early Alaska example of the method proceeding through a full jury trial. You open a training binder where the sequence appears in careful steps, each one built upon the preserved sample. The lesson was not simply to upload every old profile into every available database. Investigators had to consider legal rules, database policies, case severity, remaining evidence, and whether traditional searches had already been exhausted. They also needed genealogists capable of documenting their reasoning and laboratories able to confirm any candidate independently. We follow this measured framework, noticing how a powerful method becomes safer when surrounded by restraint. Database policies evolved after the first widely publicized genealogy cases. Some services introduced clearer consent choices, limited law enforcement access, or required users to opt into particular comparisons. Investigators could no longer assume that the process used in 2018 would remain unchanged. You can almost hear website terms being revised while court decisions accumulate, shaping a moving boundary around genetic access. This changing environment made the legal examination of Downes's case especially important. The search had occurred under GE'd match practices, existing in 2018, before many later adjustments and public debates. A court reviewing the search had to evaluate what investigators and users understood at that time. We returned to archived policy language, its digital lines now treated with the same care as an old paper form. Meanwhile, Sophie's name remained present in discussions about violence against Indigenous women. Her case demonstrated both the possibility of eventual accountability and the painful length of time families may wait before receiving sustained investigative movement. A solved case doesn't erase the larger pattern of disappearances and deaths that remain unresolved. You listen to advocates speak her name at gatherings, their voices calm but persistent against the northern air. For rural Alaska communities, investigation can be complicated by geography, weather, limited local resources, and the cost of travel. Witnesses may live far from centralized laboratories and courts, while families wait for information across great distances. Sophie's journey from Pitcairn's Point to Fairbanks had been routine within her life. Yet the case that followed moved through institutions far from home. We trace those routes on a map, where rivers and air corridors connect communities like fine threads. The lower Yukon landscape carries its own rhythms, separate from university schedules and courthouse calendars. Freeze up and break up shape movement. Light expands and contracts across the year, and familiar voices travel between homes and villages. Sophie belonged to that living geography before she belonged to any legal record. As you return to her family's community in thought, the evidence box seems both necessary and painfully small beside everything it cannot contain. It cannot contain the sound of Sophie speaking with her mother, the full texture of her plans, or the private humor shared among friends. It can preserve photographs, recorded memories, and biological evidence, but it cannot preserve every ordinary hour. This is why patient casework must keep the person visible beside the science. You lay the Murphy Dome photograph atop the laboratory report, allowing human warmth to rest above technical certainty. The photograph itself survived through different forms of custody. An original print could be scanned, enlarged, displayed in court, and reproduced in news accounts, while the moment it captured remained unchanged. Sophie's arms were still outstretched in the evening air, and her friends still remembered the happiness of that outing. We noticed the slight softness of the image's colors, a material sign that even preserved things carry time upon their surfaces. The DNA sample carried time differently. It held no visible scene and offered no emotional expression. Yet, its molecular pattern remained specific enough to be compared after decades. Paper faded, magnetic tape aged, and human recollection shifted, while the profile grew more useful as scientific tools improved. You sit between the photograph and the sample, recognizing two forms of truth that speak in very different registers. Investigators could not have predicted which one would ultimately move the case. They collected broadly because future relevance is rarely visible at the first scene. A fiber might later acquire meaning. A fingerprint might meet a database entry, or a biological sample might become readable through a method still under development. The discipline lies in preserving reasonable possibilities without pretending to know which will matter. We close one envelope and open another, continuing the quiet work of selection. Evidence storage also requires decisions about space and retention. Shelves are finite. Environmental controls cost money, and agencies hold materials from many thousands of cases. Policies determine which items must remain, for how long, and under what conditions. In a homicide case without resolution, the reason for continued preservation is especially strong. You walk the narrow aisle between tall shelves, where every carton represents a different unanswered request. A label can appear almost too simple for that responsibility. It may contain an agency number, an item number, a date, initials, and a short description written within a small rectangle. Yet those few marks allow someone decades later to connect the object with a report, collection site, and legal history. You feel the label's smooth surface beneath a gloved thumb, careful not to lift its edge. Temperature and moisture remain quiet concerns. Paper needs protection from dampness, while biological material may require refrigeration, freezing, or another stable controlled environment, depending upon its form and packaging. Sudden fluctuations can damage what years of ordinary storage have preserved. We hear a compressor cycle on in the background, an unnoticed machine carrying part of the evidentiary burden through another night. Electronic records bring different vulnerabilities. Audio files must be copied without alteration, stored in reliable formats, and protected against accidental deletion or corruption. Old tapes may need digitization before equipment for playing them becomes scarce. You watch a waveform move across the computer screen as a 1993 interview enters a modern archive, its faint hiss preserved alongside every sentence. The Sergie case crossed each of these technological thresholds. It began with handwritten notes, film photographs, physical recordings, and early forensic collection. Then entered databases, digital genealogy platforms, remote court testimony, and appellate electronic filing. None replaced the original evidence entirely. Instead, each new layer depended upon the integrity of the older one, creating a long structure whose foundation remained physical. By the time appellate briefs were complete, lawyers could search electronic transcripts instantly for a name physical. By the time appellate briefs were complete, lawyers could search electronic transcripts instantly for a name or phrase. Yet, they still needed to understand where that phrase belonged within 5 weeks of testimony and nearly 30 years of investigation. Speed of retrieval did not eliminate the need for context. You type Sophie's name into the search field, then slow down when hundreds of references appear, each requiring patient reading. The appeal eventually reached oral argument before the Alaska Court of Appeals in April of 2025. By then, more than 32 years had passed since the weekend at Bartlett Hall. Downs participated by telephone while attorneys appeared before a panel of judges in Anchorage. We enter the appellate courtroom quietly, where the benches are polished, the microphones are tested, and thick records wait in digital and paper form. Oral argument differs from a jury trial because attorneys may be interrupted frequently by questions from the judges. The purpose is not to repeat every page of the briefs, but to clarify legal consequences, test boundaries, and address difficult points. A judge may offer a hypothetical situation to see how broadly a proposed rule would reach. You hear counsel begin a prepared sentence, then pause as a question redirects the path. Downs's appellate attorney argued that the genealogy search reached deeply personal information without a warrant. She maintained that genetic data deserves strong privacy protection because it can reveal identity, family relationships, ancestry, and other sensitive facts. Even though the uploaded profile belonged to a relative, the search used shared inheritance to identify Downs. We follow the argument carefully, watching one judge make a note beside the word privacy. The judges asked how a person could claim a protected interest in data voluntarily uploaded by someone else. They considered whether the search examined Downes's information directly or inferred his identity from his aunt's information and public records. The distinction sounded narrow, yet it could determine the constitutional analysis. You feel the courtroom's quiet concentration as inherited DNA becomes both shared family material and potentially individual information. The state's attorney emphasized that the aunt had chosen to upload her genetic data to a comparison service. Investigators received a list of shared segments and used ordinary public sources to build the family tree, then sought judicial authorization before collecting Downes's own cheek swab. According to the state, this sequence did not invade a privacy interest belonging to him. We trace the stages again, each separated by legal and scientific steps. One judge asked what limits would remain if law enforcement could identify a person through any relative's uploaded profile. The question carried no immediate answer, but it illuminated the broader reach of the state's position. A small portion of the population can create genetic pathways toward many more people who never used a genealogy service. You sit with that expanding map, where family branches extend beyond the edge of the courtroom screen. Another question concerned the terms presented to GED match users during 2018. Consent depends partly upon what a user was told and what users the service permitted at that moment. The aunt had used an alias, suggesting some desire for privacy, yet she also uploaded data to locate biological relatives. We examined the archived notice word by word, hearing the gentle tap of a keyboard as counsel searches for the exact language. The appellate panel also considered the excluded statement from Kenneth Moto's sister. Downes's attorney argued that it should have reached the jury because it was central to the alternative suspect defense. The state answered that the statement lacked sufficient reliability and could not be tested through cross-examination after the speaker's death. You listen as the old recording returns once more, carried now by lawyers who never participated in the original interview. A judge asked whether excluding that statement had prevented the defense from presenting its theory in a meaningful way. The answer required looking at what other evidence about Moto had been admitted, including his testimony, his history in the investigation, and his DNA exclusion. If jurors already heard the essential theory through lawful evidence, the omitted recording might not require reversal. We turn to the trial transcript again, locating each permitted reference. The sufficiency question brought the discussion back to the central sample. Downes's attorney emphasized the absence of a direct eyewitness identification, a matched weapon, fingerprints, or fibers connecting him to the room. The state emphasized the nature of the biological evidence, his denial of knowing Sophie, and his residence inside Bartlett Hall. You can hear the same facts settling into new legal arrangements as each side answers the judge's questions. No witnesses appeared at the appellate argument, and no evidence box was opened before the panel. Everything physical had already been translated into the record through the trial. The judges worked from transcripts, rulings, exhibits, and the parties' legal analysis. We sit before them with only paper and screens, aware that the original sample still rests elsewhere under secure conditions. When the argument ended, the panel took the matter under consideration. Courts do not always announce when a decision will be ready, particularly when the issues require extensive research and a written opinion. The lawyers gathered their materials, The microphones went quiet, and the judges left with questions still active. You remain at the appellate table for a moment, feeling the smooth wood beneath your wrist as another period of waiting begins. This waiting differs from the 26 winters before Downes's identification, because the case now has a conviction, a sentence, and a defined set of appellate claims. Yet it still depends upon patient review by people studying an old record. The evidence box has outlasted one unanswered investigation and entered the slower life of legal precedent. We follow the appeal clerk into a room of indexed files, where the next page awaits its place in the sequence. A draft opinion, whenever it is prepared, must account for constitutional principles, Alaska precedent, the technology used in 2018, and the precise facts of the search. Judges may agree on the outcome, while differing about reasoning, or one may write separately. Citations must be checked, factual descriptions compared against the record, and proposed rules tested against future cases. You can almost hear pages being exchanged between chambers, each margin carrying another penciled question. Meanwhile, attorneys on both sides monitor decisions from other jurisdictions involving investigative genetic genealogy. A ruling elsewhere may not control Alaska courts, but it can offer reasoning about privacy, consent, and abandoned biological information. The legal landscape develops case by case, just as the scientific method developed sample by sample. We place new opinions beside older constitutional texts, watching modern genetics enter a very old conversation about searches. The Sergie appeal therefore remains connected to cases not yet investigated and people not yet identified. A broad ruling could shape how Alaska officers use genealogy databases, what warrants they seek, and how courts evaluate relatives' consent. A narrow ruling might resolve only the particular facts before the panel. You sit with both possibilities while the appellate record remains open, its electronic docket quiet beneath the steady glow of the screen. Back in the evidence room, none of these arguments alter the physical profile preserved since 1993. The sealed materials don't know whether a search was lawful, whether a statement was admissible, or whether a judicial rule should be broad. They simply remain available for whatever lawful review comes next. You slide the storage tray forward, verify the number against the ledger, and feel the familiar cool air settle around your hands. The newest entry in that ledger carries a date far removed from the first. Different handwriting may appear beside it, or perhaps the notation exists only in an electronic tracking system now. Still, the act is recognizable. One custodian records where the material is and why it has moved. We follow the cursor across the form as another official name joins the long line of keepers. Somewhere else, a digital copy of C.C. Moore's family tree remains among the litigation materials. It contains relatives who had no connection with Sophie beyond shared inheritance. Their names included because genealogy requires branches before it reaches a candidate. Courts and attorneys must protect that information with appropriate care. You look across the branching chart and remember that every node represents a real person entitled to dignity. The same respect applies to those once investigated and later excluded. Cold case records may preserve allegations long after science has shown that an individual did not provide the central sample. Public retellings can easily repeat suspicion while forgetting the exclusion. We close those folders gently, allowing the accurate record to do what patience should always do. Narrow attention, without leaving unnecessary harm behind. At the far end of the shelf, the Sergie evidence box remains among other cases that have their own winters to endure. Some contain DNA too limited for present methods, while others wait for a witness, a database entry, or a document not yet found. Investigators cannot know which file will move next. You walk slowly along the aisle, hearing your sleeve brush cardboard as labels pass through the small pool of lamplight. Then you return to Sophie's box and open the appellate inventory once more. The first item is followed by the second, and the sequence continues through photographs, recordings, swabs, reports, motions, and exhibits gathered across more than 3 decades. Nothing asks you to hurry. You place a clean sheet beside the ledger, steady your pen, and begin checking the next number against the record. At the time of this telling, the Sophie Sergie case is legally solved. Stephen Harris Downs remains convicted of first-degree murder and first-degree sexual assault, and he is serving a sentence of 75 years. His appeal, including challenges concerning genetic genealogy and excluded evidence, has continued through the Alaska courts, but the conviction remains in place unless a court rules otherwise. The evidence waited 26 winters for a name, and the law ultimately gave that name a judgment. Still, the truest quiet belongs to Sophie, not to the technology or the courtroom. You may let the technical pages soften now, while the photograph from Murphy Dome rests beneath the small lamp, holding her in that wide April light. Her arms remain open to the northern sky, and her friends' memories remain full of movement, laughter, errands, magazines, pizza, and plans. No verdict can restore those ordinary hours, though patient work ensured they weren't entirely covered by silence. Somewhere in Alaska, the physical evidence remains carefully stored, protected because courts and appeals may still require it. The box has done what good evidence is meant to do. It waited without changing its account, while science and human knowledge slowly learned how to understand it. Around that box stood custodians, technicians, clerks, detectives, genealogists, attorneys, witnesses, and jurors, each carrying one modest part of a responsibility larger than any single keeper. You can set the file down now, and let the lamplight rest upon Sophie's photograph for one final moment, while winter settles quietly beyond the evidence room walls. The shelves require nothing more from you tonight, and the old cardboard can return to its measured stillness, holding the truth that patience finally reached. Let the northern dark grow soft around that small preserved image, and let your own thoughts become quiet